He was struck with brutal force every single day since he was a child. The one doing it was none other than his own father. Why didn't my father go buy cigarettes? The giant, hairy man wanted his son to be relentless and merciless, so that one day he might rule his organization. But the boy never fought back. He even smiled as he walked to school with his little friend, until the day came when he arrived home and saw his dear girlfriend unconscious. His father, that massive man made of pure muscle, built like a frost-free refrigerator, had just taught the girl a lesson. The boy lost his mind. That night, he beat his father so badly that the man fell into a coma. The doctors didn't know if he would ever wake up. Because of this, the boy was sent to a juvenile detention center. Initially, he was a laughingstock. The boy wanted money because he had promised his friend they would live together in Seoul. So he shoveled snow, warmed up shoes, and even became the cell boss's lapdog. Today, he had even become a human target just for the sake of money. But by luck, the elastic snapped, and the money ended up falling into the toilet. The boss's order was for him to retrieve it with his mouth, and that is exactly what he did. He just wanted those 3 years to pass by. Even when a new prisoner arrived, he avoided getting involved. The problem arose on a certain day when his friend was coming to visit him. Guess who showed up to take the girl to the other world? Our very own Truck Kun. This completely shattered the boy's mind. He spent hours and hours in his cell staring at his friend's photo, until the bullies took the photo to mock him. Initially, he didn't care when they said what they would do with the photo, but when they said what they would have done to the girl if she hadn't been taken by Truck Kun, he went insane. He struck the boss's head with such force that it caused a 7.1 magnitude tremor. The joke was over, and now he would have no mercy for anyone. From now on, he has no reason to hold back. The only reason he had no longer exists. When the guards entered the room, they were horrified. Only he was left standing, and there was ketchup everywhere. If the new prisoner hadn't stopped him at that moment, solitary confinement would have been the least of his problems. A week had passed, and he was out for recreation. One of the bullies who wanted to be the new leader came to bother him. The protagonist didn't care at first. He even took a beating without fighting back. But when the man revealed a tattoo similar to the one his father had and started talking about his friend's accident, his patience ran out. He quickly immobilized the guy. And this tattooed arm? I don't think you'll be needing it anymore. Everyone was stunned by Ju Young. He had just come out of solitary. And now he was already destroying someone else in front of everyone without a hint of remorse? Meanwhile, we see the silhouette of a man in a higher part of the prison, wondering what the commotion down below is about. Another man responds that there were quite a few energetic kids down there, while enjoying his tea and expressing happiness that the man was in good health. We then discover that this man is the prison director, Kwon Chang-suk, who speaks to the person in a very friendly tone. The silhouette belongs to a man who had just been discharged from the hospital, and the director says that if he needs anything, he will help in any way he can, asking what the reason for his visit is. We see all the prisoners returning to their dormitories, and Mae Gyeom starts writing something in his notebook again. He was clearly beginning to feel afraid of Ju Young, noting that he was sharing a cell with a completely lunatic guy. He had seen everything the boy had done so far and knew better than anyone what he was capable of when he was angry. At that moment, a guard arrives at the cell and calls out Ju Young's name, telling him that he has a visitor waiting for him. He leaves his cell handcuffed, accompanying the guard while wondering who could be visiting him. It couldn't be his mother, as she had abandoned him when he was younger, and all of his relatives were avoiding him because of the situation he was in. Without realizing it, instead of heading to the visiting room, he was escorted to another location, which turned out to be a director's office. It clearly didn't seem like a normal situation, raising even more doubts in his mind. But as the door opened, and he saw the mysterious man seen earlier, he began to understand the situation better. The man began to speak to him, expressing happiness at seeing his son full of life. Ju Young, in disbelief at seeing his father there talking normally, just stared at him speechless. For the first time, we see the face of his father, named Cha Gangrion, who has a scar across his left eye and a visible dragon tattoo. The director stands next to the boy, saying that he seemed quite surprised by the situation. He explains that his father had miraculously woken up recently, being healthy again, as if it were a divine blessing. Recalling what the doctor had said, Ju Young seemed unable to believe his eyes, wondering why all of this was happening. But his father interrupts his thoughts, beginning to say something that seems like a confession. Despite having been the right-hand man of a criminal organization throughout his life, the person who nearly ended his story wasn't any of his enemies, nor was it the police, but his own son. He recounts that when he opened his eyes and realized he was in the hospital, he felt immense sadness toward the boy. And as a father, he wanted very much to see his son again, saying that he loved him and that there was nothing in the world he wouldn't do for Ju Young. With tears streaming down his face, he also explains that he had no choice but to do what he did. This statement confuses Ju Young, who tries to understand what his father is saying with this entire speech. And Gangrion reveals that the man who had ended his friend's life that day was actually him. As Gangrion continued his story, he recounted that after she was hit by the car, Diane was still breathing but couldn't move due to the impact. She pleaded for help from a man who was nearby watching her. But when he realized who she was, his eyes widened in shock. This prompted Gangrion to ask the girl if she had seen a ghost. Even in her injured state, the man confronted her about what she had said to him years ago in his house before he went into a coma. He told her that his next action was an example of the sacrifices parents make for their children. And without any empathy for the girl, he said, But come to think of it, maybe this girl doesn't understand my reasons. After all, she's someone who didn't even have parents to begin with. Returning to the present in the prison, Gangryong with a certain pride said he had thought his son was just a pathetic person who endured everything silently. But on that day, it was the first time he saw the boy truly act, with the girl being his trigger to explode in anger. And because of that, he decided to end her life. The man had come back from far away just to take her life, claiming it was all for his son's sake, as if it made any sense in his twisted mind. The director then noticed something unusual when, without saying a word, Ju-young charged at his father with the right hook. But before he could land the punch, the guards shot him with a few tasers. They began trying to restrain the boy against his will, who fell to the ground due to the shock, struggling to stay conscious. Looking down at Ju-young on the floor, Gangryong asked if he wanted revenge against his own father. And even without getting a response, he told his son the only way to achieve that. Some members of his gang were in that reformatory, but they were just rookies who had barely earned their tattoos. However, some of them would undoubtedly become key figures in the organization in the future. To reach his father, Ju-young needed to prove himself the best, take control, rise through the ranks, and earn recognition in that place. Until he was capable of defeating him and surpassing him as second in command, he would need to prepare to face the Celestial Dragon organization. His reward would be achieving something even Gangryong had never done, and if he succeeded, his life would be complete. In a parting tone, he asked the director to take care of his son, who assured him not to worry. But to everyone's surprise, Ju-young, even with electric currents running through his body, got up and advanced toward his father. He told Gangryong to stop spouting nonsense because the time for his revenge wasn't in the future. It was right now. With a leap towards Gangryong, he tried to attack him from behind, but a figure appeared behind him, preventing the boy from advancing. The man immobilized Ju-young by forcing his head down to the ground. The man protecting Gangryong apologized to the boy, whom he called Young Master, but said it was his duty to serve his boss's orders. Even immobilized, Ju-young continued trying to advance towards his father, but achieving his revenge there didn't seem possible anymore. His father asked him to open his eyes and observe the situation so that he could better understand that he would never be able to reach him. Surrounded by dozens of people, his father seemed untouchable, and reckless actions would only make things worse for the boy. The only way to truly get revenge on his father was to take complete control of the prison, something his father said with a smile, waiting for the day to come, before turning his back and leaving. Ju-young then finally accepted what he needed to do, and as all the henchmen left, we see him trembling, supporting himself on the ground. Some time passed, and life in the detention center continued, showing us the woodworking room. Meg-yeom was seen hammering some nails quickly, reaching his daily quota and earning a break. Seeing his skill with the tool, the prisoners remarked that the boy was indeed very good with a hammer, and that maybe he had used one to kill the bullies who tormented him at school. But looking at Meg-yeom, they didn't feel like he was a killer, just another loser. At that moment, a new person arrived, bringing some tools to the workshop. One of the men asked him to take the tools to the shelf, and as he approached the spot, he came face to face with Meg-yeom. The two turned to look at each other, locking eyes for a brief moment. The boy dropped the tools he was carrying, and a nail fell right at Meg-yeom's feet. Meg-yeom stares at the nail on the floor for a few moments as if it triggers a memory. A new character named Yoon Gunmin appears, striking up a conversation with the killer, calling him by name as if they were old acquaintances. We learn that these two actually knew each other from attending elementary school together many years ago. Gunmin mentions that he had seen Meg-yeom on the news and was surprised to have run into him in a place like prison. Seizing the opportunity, he brings up a question that's been on his mind, asking Meg-yeom if he really had taken the lives of 7 students all by himself as reported in the newspapers. Because Meg-yeom had been such an exemplary student when he was younger, Gunmin couldn't imagine him doing something like that. At this moment, Meg-yeom begins to grip the tool in his hand with all his strength, as if he's uncomfortable with the conversation. But luckily for him, a guard interrupts them, telling Gunmin to get back to work and stop all the idle chatter. Gunmin bids Meg-yeom farewell as he returns to his workbench, while Meg-yeom continues to stare at the nails on the table in front of him. The killer had been gripping the hammer and a nail so tightly during the conversation that he hadn't even realized his hand was bleeding. Back in his cell, we see Ju-young sitting on the floor, deep in thought. He was remembering what his father had said to him, determined to hunt down the man who called him son. But he still didn't know how he was going to do it. One of the other prisoners in the cell complains about being starving, disappointed by the prison's all-vegetable menu. They gripe a bit, saying they could die happy if they at least had a slice of pizza to eat that day. A guard approaches them, causing the conversation to stop, and Ju-young takes the opportunity to call them over to the cell. The officer asks if something is wrong, but Ju-young says no, only asking if they delivered pizza. The guard questions the boy, reminding him that he's in a prison, and tells him to step out of the cell immediately to talk. In the next scene, the prisoner who had wished for a pizza is seen holding one in his hands, his wish fulfilled. After being locked up for so long, it had been a long time since they'd eaten anything from outside the prison, and they thanked Ju-young for making it happen. Ju-young had managed this because the guards were under his father's influence. And because of this, Ju-young wanted to test how far the limits of that influence could go, given that he was his father's son. For his revenge, the boy seemed ready to do and use anything to reach his final goal. While reflecting on his plans, we see the conversation among the prisoners continue, wondering why Meg-yeom wasn't eating pizza. He seemed strange that day ever since he had run into Gunmin earlier, clearly leaving him tense and trembling. The next day, we see the two of them returning to the workbenches in the woodworking room to begin their work. Gutman, once again carrying tools to the area, drops them again as if he's doing it on purpose. In doing so, he lets several nails fall near Mae-gyum as if he's trying to provoke him in some way. He then apologizes, giving Mae-gyum a sinister look and a smile, clearly getting under Mae-gyum's skin. Some of Gutman's friends appear, watching the boy and asking him some questions. Gutman had said that the person who had killed 7 students was his subordinate, but seeing the two stare each other down, they wondered if Gutman might be lying. But to prove he was telling the truth, Gutman tells the prisoners that Mae-gyum had been sucking up to him since they were just kids. He asks if Mae-gyum remembers the good times they had together, as he approaches him and grabs him by the head. Pressing Mae-gyum's head towards a nail on his workbench, he begins to recall the time they spent together in elementary school. Gutman seemed to torment Mae-gyum daily for his own amusement. We see a flashback of Mae-gyum trapped behind a wooden door with several nails sticking out of it. Gutman seemed to take pleasure in torturing the boy by hammering those nails on the other side of the door to frighten him. Back in the woodworking room, Mae-gyum is trembling as he remembers those terrible moments from his childhood, with a nail now dangerously close to his left eye. A few moments before Ju-young goes to find his cellmate, we see a conversation happening in the prison. The prisoners are wondering where Mae-gyum is, saying they haven't seen him. One of them mentions that he was suddenly called to the woodworking room to help with cleaning, which piques Ju-young's interest. Ju-young rises to his feet, asking the others if they were really planning to clean the woodworking room at that hour. He then speaks again to the guards stationed outside the cell. His cellmates perk up, thinking he's about to request something similar to the pizza he got them last time, but Ju-young simply asks the guard to open the door for him. The scene shifts back to the fight in the woodworking room, where 2 of the 4 prisoners from Gutman's group are already unconscious on the floor. The tallest and strongest member of the group asks Ju-young if that's his name, indicating that he's already familiar with the protagonist due to his reputation in the prison. Gutman interrupts before Ju-young can respond, saying that he's starting to understand the situation more clearly now. He asks Ju-young if he and Mae-gyum are close friends, expressing envy for Mae-gyum having such a reliable person by his side. Gutman's friend mentions that he likes Ju-young's loyalty, and while preparing a punch with his right hand, he asks if Ju-young wants to be his friend too. Ju-young, using the momentum from the floor, lunges at the prisoner, grabbing him by the collar and effortlessly taking down the giant with a leg sweep using his right leg and the weight of his opponent. He slams the man's head into the ground and with a look of superiority says that he'd rather die than be friends with someone like him. Apparently finishing off the third man, Ju-young turns to Gutman, calling him Blondie. He asks Gutman why he went so far with Mae-gyum, pushing him past his limits. But Gutman, unfazed, asks if Ju-young is messing with him. Seizing this opportunity to talk, Gutman begins to explain his reasons to Ju-young, trying to justify his anger by sharing some details, capturing Ju-young's attention. But while he talks, his other friend, the previously knocked down giant, gets up behind Ju-young. Surprised by the towering figure now back on his feet and preparing a chokehold, Ju-young realizes that Gutman's words were just a distraction. The giant wraps his right arm around Ju-young's neck, applying pressure, leaving Ju-young with few options to fight back. In desperation, Ju-young decides to break the man's finger to free himself. But before he can act, Gutman suddenly stabs him in the stomach, causing Ju-young unbearable pain and making it hard for him to breathe. Just then, Mae-gyum emerges from a locker, pleading with the giant to release his cellmate, warning that the chokehold could break Ju-young's neck. In Mae-gyum's hands, we see a chain that he uses to strangle the giant, pulling him backward. Gutman tries to figure out how Mae-gyum got out of the locked locker and remembers that the lock had broken earlier during the fight. The giant tries to resist the pull of the chain with brute force, but this is a mistake as Mae-gyum warns him that using such force will only break his neck faster as he presses his right foot against the man's head. The prisoner struggles to resist, but Mae-gyum warns him that if he doesn't stop pulling, his death will be inevitable. Ignoring Mae-gyum's warning, the giant continues to struggle until he loses consciousness, collapsing to the hard floor. Mae-gyum catches his breath and glares at Gutman walking toward him. Now it's Gutman who begins to panic, claiming to be the victim in all of this as he backs away in fear. As Mae-gyum approaches closer, Gutman trips and falls backward, landing on his back before quickly kneeling and begging for forgiveness. He clutches Mae-gyum's feet, pleading for him to forget the situation, admitting that he's just a born idiot, exactly as Mae-gyum always thought. But Mae-gyum surprises Gutman by saying that he never actually thought that way about him. Even though Gutman had ruined his life, Mae-gyum explains that killing him wouldn't erase the past events. He confesses that he had considered what to do with Gutman, but looking at him now, he realizes he doesn't hate the boy as much as he thought, since they were friends once. Gutman starts to think Mae-gyum is being foolish and naive, but before he can finish his thought, Ju-young delivers a powerful kick to his head. Gutman is sent flying several meters forward from the impact of the kick. Holding the wound that Gutman inflicted on his stomach, Ju-young says the debt is now settled. Some time passes after the fight in the woodworking room, and we see the two back together in the prison dormitory, where Ju-young asks Mae-gyum if he's an idiot. Mae-gyum doesn't understand why he's being insulted, so Ju-young explains, how can a killer who took out 7 people be afraid of a chicken like Gutman? Mae-gyum tries to explain that it wasn't fear, but Ju-young seems to understand him better now. Even though he didn't fully grasp the issue between the two, Ju-young realizes that Mae-geum doesn't see him as an enemy. Mae-geum smiles and answers his question affirmatively. We return to the scene of the last fight, with the two of them standing after their victory, and Mae-geum takes the opportunity to thank the injured Ju-young for helping him. A partnership with his first ally seemed to be forming at that moment, but they are suddenly surprised. A man emerges from the shadows, crouching next to Gunman's defeated body, muttering something to him. He asks why Gunman left the cell without his permission, expressing fear over a cockroach that had appeared. He blames Gunman for not being there to kill it, since he's terrified of cockroaches, and then he starts beating Gunman's face as if he's lost his mind. Blood splatters everywhere, making the unknown person even more uncomfortable as he becomes dirtied and filled with germs. Without caring, he wipes his face on Ju-young's shirt. He then asks Ju-young if his face is clean now, with bloodstains all over and menacing look in his eyes. Ju-young doesn't respond to the prisoner who suddenly appeared. Even though the man seems mentally unstable, this doesn't scare Ju-young. Ju-young bluntly tells him the truth, that his face is still filthy, which enrages the man. Before another fight can break out, a guard arrives, asking if their work is finished and telling them they can return to their respective cells. Before leaving, the man repeatedly mutters Ju-young's inmate number, 7199, as if trying to memorize it. The next day, we see an image of the prison yard, where all the inmates from Ju-young's cell are gathered around him, looking serious. Ju-young asks why everyone is crowding around him, and Gunman explains the current situation. A rumor had spread in the prison that Ju-young was very strong, so no one dared to mess with the group if they were near him. The protagonist then says he doesn't mind them being close, but that they should at least not bother him because he has things to do. He wanted to return to his focus on finding the people with a red flower dragon tattoo, eager to eliminate his father's minions. Gunman asks what he's looking for, to which Ju-young replies that he's trying to find something specific. Naman offers to help find what he's looking for since he's known in the prison for gathering information. Ju-young explains that he's looking for a specific, filthy tattoo. Later that afternoon, we see everyone gathered in the prison's common room watching a news report on criminal gangs of juvenile delinquents. The situation was out of control as these gangs began forming systematic groups to extort money and material goods. The group from Ju-young's cell discusses the documentary until the protagonist mutters a word of disgust, cursing the delinquents on TV. He says that, in his opinion, they should all rot in prison, which makes his group uncomfortable. This prompts Naman to explain that not everyone there is evil at heart and begins to tell the story of how he ended up in prison. He talks about a legendary shop in his neighborhood called Teppanyaki. Naman was a regular customer there because he liked the quality of the food they served. But one day, a lunatic, the son of a local congressman who abused his father's influence, showed up at the shop. They ordered food and then began criticizing the quality, deciding to trash the place simply because they could. But at that moment, Naman, who is now a prisoner, appeared and decided to confront the group of delinquents, claiming to be the leader of the Teppanyaki enthusiasts. He fought all of them, leaving them unconscious on the floor, while telling himself that he had become the hero who protected that shop that day. But this incident led to him being sent to the juvenile detention center due to the influence of that person. After telling his story with as much pride as possible, another cellmate chimes in, saying that Naman actually has a reputation for being a big liar. No one believes his story, even though he swears it's true. Ju-young decides to lie and pretends to believe what Naman said to gain his trust. With this attitude, Naman starts to think that Ju-young wants to keep him close and that one day he might even become his right-hand man. Deluded by his thoughts, he laughs to himself while tending to what looks like a prison garden. As Naman absent-mindedly swings his cultivation tool, he accidentally flings dirt onto the face of a passing prisoner. Realizing whom he had hit, Naman freezes. It's the same man who had appeared near Gunman's body, someone who clearly has an aversion to being dirty. Now with his face covered in dirt, the man recalls Ju-young's earlier words calling him filthy. This memory triggers his rage once more, and we learn that this man was actually Naman's former cell leader, a mentally unstable individual. Naman quickly apologizes, saying he hadn't seen the prisoner there, but the man furiously asks if Naman plans to clean up the mess he made. Trembling with fear, Naman promises to clean it, revealing to the reader that this man is obsessed with cleanliness, bordering on madness. The man pulls out a can of insecticide from his pocket and sprays it directly into Naman's face. Naman falls to his knees, his eyes burning with pain, and the man explains that he had come looking for Naman of his own volition to ask him something. The man repeats Ju-young's inmate number, 7199, saying he's searching for the boy who shares his cell with Naman. Naman realizes that this is indeed Ju-young's number, and the madman explains that the person he's looking for had the audacity to call him filthy. The man is visibly upset, insisting that he works hard to stay clean, and he demands that they go together to find Ju-young. As the madman rants, Naman notices a tattoo on the man's right side. It's the same tattoo that Ju-young had been searching for, the red flower dragon. The scene cuts to another location showing Ju-young working out in his cell. Unsuccessful in his search, Ju-young is seen doing one-armed push-ups, his mind solely focused on finding those with the dragon tattoo. Just then, Naman appears beside him, interrupting his alone time and trying to strike up a conversation. Before Ju-young can respond, Naman suspiciously offers him a juice out of nowhere. Ju-young accepts the juice but senses something is off. He asks Naman where he got the insecticide. We then flash back to Naman's past, showing him in a cell holding another prisoner, who has a funnel forced into his mouth. Naaman's former cell leader, the same madman, is seen in a frenzy, screaming that the cellmate's filthy mouth had made him dirty. Holding a bottle of bleach, the madman approaches the restrained prisoner, preparing to pour the liquid down the funnel, claiming he's just cleaning him. As he does so, the prisoner passes out, but instead of being concerned about the unconscious body, the madman becomes even more frantic over the mess on the floor. Naaman's former cell was a living hell ruled by a truly uncontrollable demon. Back in the present, Ju-young continues questioning Naaman about the insecticide. Naaman lies again, but his cellmates, knowing his reputation as a liar, become increasingly suspicious and press him with more questions. Realizing that poisoning the cell leader would cause him serious trouble, Naaman begins to worry. But to everyone's surprise, Ju-young grabs the drink and downs it in one go, casually commenting that the juice was delicious and thanking Naaman. Ju-young then informs everyone that there would be a group cleaning session the next day, asking them to prepare, completely ignoring the previous topic. From Ju-young's perspective, this was a test to see if Naaman would actually follow through with offering him the drink. As the day goes by, we see Ju-young at night, sketching the dragon tattoo he's searching for in a notebook. Naaman seizes this opportunity and approaches him, asking what he's drawing, try and get even closer to him. Ju-young explains everything and Naaman starts plotting how to poison Ju-young for real without arousing suspicion. After finishing his explanation, Ju-young asks if Naaman has any questions, to which Naaman responds by asking why Ju-young trusts him. He tells Ju-young that you should normally doubt people like him because trusting others recklessly will only cause problems. Realizing what he said, Naaman begins to question why he spoke out like that, as if he couldn't control his own words. But calmly, Ju-young replies, saying that someone capable of deceiving others is actually quite smart, and a smart person like that wouldn't become his enemy with such stupid lies. Ju-young then stands up, telling Naaman that he's going to turn off the lights and that it's time to sleep. The following day, two guards are seen discussing an upcoming routine inspection by the Ministry of Justice. They order the prisoners to clean everything as thoroughly as possible before the visit. Prisoners can be seen in the corridors with brooms, scrubbing the floors and cleaning their cells. Not long after, Naaman's former cell leader confronts him, demanding that he disinfect Ju-young with the insecticide, reminding him of the promise he made. With a sinister look, he asks if Naaman is backing out, but instead of answering directly, Naaman lies, saying that Ju-young felt very guilty about the incident. He tries to avoid confrontation by spinning more lies, but the madman, aware of Naaman's reputation, isn't fooled. He decides to punish Naaman for his dishonesty by punching him in the stomach. The crazed man, now completely hysterical, keeps repeating Ju-young's inmate number, saying he can't forgive him. As he continues to assault Naaman, he forces his head into the urinal, pressing it down with his foot, determined to disinfect both Naaman and Ju-young himself. He opens a bottle of bleach and flushes the urinal, attempting to drown him in. Just before Naaman loses consciousness, Ju-young arrives, confronting the madman. The madman turns to face Ju-young and hears the boy calling him filthy and dirty. Naaman, half-drowned and struggling to breathe, looks at his cell leader, asking why it took him so long to show up, implying that this was all part of a trap. During the earlier cleaning, Naaman had confided in Ju-young that someone had threatened him, demanding that he poison Ju-young with insecticide. But being born into this world as a man, Naaman confessed that he couldn't betray a friend, refusing to give in to such threats. Naaman had emptied the insecticide bottle and tossed it away, knowing that he would face the consequences of his actions sooner or later. He also revealed that one of the people with the dragon tattoo Ju-young was looking for was the very person who had threatened him. Back in the present, as the confrontation in the bathroom intensifies, Ju-young smears something on his hand. He casually walks up to the madman and wipes his hand on the man's clothes, which instantly enrages him. The madman starts hurling threats at Ju-young, but Ju-young ignores him, grabbing the man by his shirt and slamming him hard onto the floor. Ju-young then asks if he was the one who threatened his cellmate, saying that he would kill him. Seeing the dragon tattoo, Ju-young feels a twisted sense of joy, as he now has a reason to beat the man without feeling guilty. The story reveals that there once was a promising martial arts star known for his signature move, grabbing an opponent by the abdomen and squeezing. The move seemed unbeatable, but its secret lay in trapping the opponent's hands, preventing them from tapping out in the fight. However, after one particular day, this move was never used again because an opponent vomited all over the fighter during the hold. The promising star, who was known for playing dirty, developed a terrible psychological weakness called misophobia, the fear of germs. Returning to the bathroom fight, Ju-young continues to confront his opponent, demanding information about the celestial dragon. But the madman can only think about the germs on the bathroom floor, screaming that his skin is rotting because of it. He furiously tries to attack Ju-young, but Ju-young easily counters his moves. The madman repeats Ju-young's inmate number again, vowing to kill him. But Ju-young tells him that he doesn't understand the situation. He wets his hand with the liquid from the bathroom floor and tries to force the fighter to open his mouth, pushing his filthy hand near the man's face. We see a flashback of the fighter, showing him as a young man who already had some compulsions about cleanliness, complaining about sweating too much. He opens his locker, intending to take a shower to clean himself, but to his shock, someone had previously filled the locker with garbage as a trap. As the trash pours out, the fighter he had made vomit in the ring earlier appears behind him. This man had come to settle the score, saying that he had been ridiculed by others because of what happened in the ring. He picks up a piece of paper from the trash, calls the fighter human garbage, and tries to force feed it to him. But it seems that he made a grave mistake, just as Ju Young realized when he tried to force his hand into the man's mouth. Anyone who leaves this man dirty is bound to suffer the worst fate. The fighter quickly regains control of the situation, flipping Ju Young onto his back and pinning him down, straddling him with fury in his eyes. As the madman tightens his grip, threatening to crush Ju Young's organs with his technique, Ju Young's mind flashes back to his childhood, remembering how his father would never hug him, but when he decided to beat him, he would hold him with enough force to break every bone in his body. These painful memories fuel Ju Young's resolve, allowing him to regain his composure. He grabs the madman's hands and flips him back onto the ground. Ju Young, now in control, tells the madman that he's used to fighting on the ground, just like he's used to relieving himself. He delivers powerful strikes to the madman's ribs on both sides and then twists the man's arms with all his strength. Ju Young taunts him, asking if he should snap his arms or break his spine first. The madman, racked with pain, tries to surrender, leaving Ju Young confused as he had never seen anyone give up a fight before. With the fight over, the madman is left tied up with a funnel in his mouth, desperately trying to scream. Namin informs Ju Young that the madman is still trying to resist. The two question how someone so much like them could be so difficult to understand. With their current strategy failing, Namin suggests they have no choice but to urinate into the funnel in the madman's mouth. Ju Young prepares to do so, complaining that out of all the possible methods, this one is the most shocking. The madman thrashes on the floor as Namin tries to force him to drink lemon juice through the funnel. Ju Young wonders aloud what it would taste like, which finally makes the madman stop resisting. Ju Young then re-asks his questions about the Celestial Dragon organization, demanding to know everything the madman can tell him. The madman starts to talk, recounting the moment he got his tattoo from a woman. As she worked, she spoke of how such a large organization as the Red Flower Dragon would accept someone like him. The woman, dressed in black with long hair, explained that while the dragon represented strength and power, the flower symbolized life and vitality. She informed him that the organization sought seeds that would grow into the next generation, people like him. But no matter how beautifully a flower blooms, it would eventually wither and fall to the ground dead. These novices were full of potential that adults no longer had. Depending on the environment and the experiences they went through, they could grow tremendously. The organization aimed to cultivate these talents in its own garden. Those who grew flourished beautifully like the flowers of the Celestial Dragon. As he recounts a bit about the gang's recruitment, we return to the bathroom interrogation. The madman then admits he's just a low-ranking member and doesn't know much beyond that, pleading to be released. Ju Young realizes that his father had deliberately created a violent environment for him to grow up in, ensuring that he would develop exponentially. Interrupting his thoughts, the madman asks why Ju Young is so curious about the organization, wondering if he's interested in joining them. The madman speculates that Ju Young might want to join and even offers to recommend him personally to the organization, which instantly angers Ju Young. Ju Young grabs the prisoner by the neck, leaving the man shocked and confused by the sudden attack. The madman, in a panic, insists that he's told Ju Young everything he knows, but Ju Young, consumed by fury, chokes him into unconsciousness, telling him to shut up. Ju Young then prepares to punch the man, aiming for his face, unable to contain his rage, and lands a solid blow. A short while later, we see the prisoners cleaning the bathroom again, with Ju Young complaining about a stubborn stain on the floor. He considers fetching some bleach, but Gunamin appears with a bottle in hand, offering it to Ju Young, who questions if Namin has lost his mind. Namin ignores the question, and Ju Young thanks him, commenting that now that they've dealt with Tak, he can finally sleep in peace. Ju Young corrects him, saying that Tak is still alive, and takes the opportunity to ask Namin about being tortured with bleach in his old cell. Typically, people who ingest bleach through a funnel don't survive, yet Namin is standing there perfectly fine. Namin explains that people who suffer such an attack usually foam at the mouth due to the substance. But when it was his turn to suffer at the hands of his former cell leader, he had swapped the bleach for soapy water. Namin, recalling the past, admits that nothing actually happened to him because he had fabricated the entire story to report to the guards and arrange for a cell transfer, preparing everything in advance. He remembers the rage the madman felt when he discovered the deception, calling it terrifying. Ju Young, uninterested in thanks, tells Namin that he doesn't need to be grateful because he already helped him find someone with the organization's tattoo. Continuing the conversation, Namin asks why Ju Young is hunting down such a frightening gang. Ju Young replies that he plans to kill every one of them. He explains that he's already taken down 2 members and is close to finding the rest. Namin then mentions that there are many people in the prison with tattoos. The two start discussing whether the members might share a common trait, trying to piece together clues. They begin to realize that all the members they've encountered so far were also cell leaders. Ju Young recalls that there's a scheduled meeting for all cell leaders in a few days, an event called the One-Day Assembly. Namin, surprised that Ju Young is unaware, explains the details. Once every quarter, the cell leaders gather in a room to strengthen alliances, officially recognized as a legitimate event by the prison administration. But in reality, the meeting is a front for discussing what can happen in the prison, an illegal cartel of sorts where all kinds of illicit deals are made. Namin warns Ju Young that if he plans to attend, where all his potential enemies will be gathered, he must be extremely cautious. He reminds Ju Young of something he seems to have forgotten, Juvenile criminals from all over the country are specifically brought to this prison. Among them is one individual who is more dangerous than all the others. Without revealing the name, Namin advises Ju-young not to draw too much attention to himself. As Namin finishes talking, we see a shovel placed at the entrance of the room where the meeting will soon take place. With the highly anticipated day of the meeting arriving, everyone begins to gather in the designated room, and we see some members of the Celestial Dragon organization. They discuss how several members have been defeated, attributing it to someone named Ju-young. The story introduces several characters panel by panel without revealing their names until someone interrupts by opening the door. A person enters, grabs the shovel seen earlier at the entrance, holding it in their left hand. The newcomer asks if it was really so easy to find all of them. Breaking the shovel in half with his bare hands, he complains about all the trouble he went through to find them, now ready to start a fight. He surveys the room, deciding to attack one of the organization's members, asking why this seedling of a man was even there. He points the broken end of the shovel handle at the man's neck. In the detention center's yard, we see some prisoners working with shovels, including Ju-young and his cellmates Megyeom and Gu Namin. Moments before the leaders' meeting begins, they discuss the matter while working. Namin asks Megyeom to say a few encouraging words to their leader, even though Megyeom has no idea what the leaders' meeting is about. Ju-young explains that it's a meeting point in the prison for criminals approved directly by the warden. It's known for illegal negotiations and information exchanges. Megyeom, following Namin's request, wishes Ju-young a good meeting in the most generic way possible, which irritates Namin. Namin corrects him, adding be careful before a good meeting, showing a small moment of camaraderie between them. Namin once again warns Ju-young not to cause trouble in the meeting to avoid drawing the attention of everyone in a room with no way out. Returning to the scene of the meeting and Ju-young's advance, Ju-young locks eyes with the gang member, threatening to drive the broken handle into his neck, declaring that he will destroy all the seedlings of the organization. His opponent, instead of defending himself, chooses not to retaliate even at the risk of his life being taken by Ju-young. Ju-young demands that he fight back and tries to provoke him, but the man refuses and thanks him, showing no fear of the situation. This confuses Ju-young, and the man explains that a cell leader can use violence under the pretext of maintaining order. He tells Ju-young that he seems to be behaving this way because of that rule, but he has missed the most important part of it. He explains that in the recent fights Ju-young had with the 3 defeated cell leaders, he likely had justifiable reasons for his actions, and this concept is usually referred to by the organization as justification. The man finally explains that engaging in a fight with Ju-young without any benefit or reason for himself wouldn't be worth the effort to respond in the way Ju-young wanted. However, he warns that if Ju-young insists on fighting and disrupting the order of the prison, the other cell leaders surrounding them wouldn't let him escape alive. With a smile on his face, he asks if, knowing all this, Ju-young is still willing to stab him. This makes Ju-young reconsider his initial strategy. Even though it was reckless, confirming the information he had heard now seemed like a good idea. The man stands up, his hands still in his pockets, and asks if Ju-young is finished with that clumsy charade. He states that Ju-young never truly intended to kill him, as if he's been inside Ju-young's mind, knowing everything he planned to do. Turning his back to Ju-young, he deduces from his actions that the boy seems hostile towards the Celestial Dragon. He then asks if Ju-young really doesn't know his proper place, calling him pathetic. After Ju-young's tense entrance, the meeting finally begins with the prisoner announcing it, lamenting the absence of a few individuals. He mentions the 3 prisoners who were previously defeated by Ju-young due to severe injuries. One of the organization members, holding a rosary, mourns the situation alongside the announcer. The announcer continues, stating that the cause of all this was someone named Ju-young, now formally introduced as the new leader of Cell 36. Everyone comments on him being the guy from the rumors and are curious about which gang he belongs to. Joyeon Cha, in turn, realizes that there are about 15 cell leaders gathered there who at first glance do not have the Celestial Dragon tattoo, except for one guy. As the new leader, the boy with glasses asks if the protagonist has anything to say. Then he thinks but responds by asking if there's really anything so special about being a cell leader. Anyway, the boy says he is looking forward to it, but clearly already manages to cause discomfort among his peers. Moving on to the second topic about the sources of income operated by the cell leaders inside the prison, also known as stores. A portion of the profits from these stores is going to the director, but someone there had not paid part of the tribute for this semester, the gambling den of Doan Park. But about this, the gangster apologizes for the mistake and confirms, saying he will ensure delivery by the end of the day. Speaking of which, another boy remembers a strange rumor circulating in the area. This rumor said that all high-stakes gambling games in the den, which were supposed to be based on trust, were actually a big fraud. Doan Park replied that he would never do that, since everyone knew what happened to those who got caught. And to solidify his trust, if they discovered that there was fraud in his den, the gangster allowed anyone there to feel free to end him. So the meeting continued with topics like the distribution of cigarettes and night fell. In a mechanic's shop, someone starts to speak louder, pleading please. He asks them to stop, saying he has already suffered enough. He begs them not to continue with this, completely desperate. Then the young man was betting and had just lost to someone with a terrible hand. If he continued, he would surely hit rock bottom, but anyway, this is the betting den. The place is also a workshop that serves as a vocational training center, and Jai Lono welcomes new clients. There the games are said to be simpler than in a conventional casino, As each table has a different type of game, he recommends the dice game to start and claims it will be a lot of fun. Then the client behind asks if it's true and if he should only play one round, thinking that stalling will ruin the fun. Do-won Park had said before that he would be the only one to get hurt if they tried to take him down without justification. But that also meant that in the opposite case, having a proved justification in hand, everything would be different. So whether by beating him up or cutting off the gangster's lifeline, the protagonist crushes the die on the floor, thinking he will be able to do whatever he wants. Jae Yun-ho becomes desperate, but the protagonist just asks him to take a look, especially since there was a magnet inside that die, which proved the rumor about fraud happening in the casino. A juvenile detention center operates with the goal of rehabilitating young offenders under strict management and supervision. At least that's what everyone outside knows. Kwon Chang-seok, who is the 26th director of the juvenile detention center after having worked there, turned the place into a den of crime. Inside the prison, there are sources of profit mainly operated by inmates in leadership positions, commonly referred to as stores. Some of the profits from these operations are given to the director, and in return, what remains for the inmate leaders are benefits and freedoms that common prisoners could never dream of. Indeed, no one would imagine that a criminal cartel was being created inside a juvenile detention center. But this is one of those stores named Betting Den, led by Do-won Park. Inside this store, a man feels his heart race and no longer knows what to do because all his money is gone. So desperate, all the young man can do is bet one more round to try to win. But before that, Do-won Park appears and says he has a way. That way is him lending money to the boy, obviously with a signed document from him as collateral. Right away, that young man told the boss to go to hell and not to mess with him. But instead of denying, he accepted, only questioning why Do-won Park hadn't said so before like a true addict. Back to the present situation, the issue of the magnet inside the die was brought up by the protagonist. And if this is really true, it was a clear indication of fraud in the casino. Jae Yun-ho starts to sweat cold, trying to understand what is happening. Then Nam-gu picks up the die again and tells everyone that this is manipulation of the results. A commotion begins when everyone starts to question the matter, but the protagonist asks if he is wrong. In this context, it becomes clear that the assistant manipulates the die with the magnet and then chooses which number will come up. However, Jae Yun-ho simply responds to the accusations by saying they are wrong. Calmly, he explains that that ball, confused with a magnet, is used to stabilize the center of gravity of the die. It's basically a weight, and having a real magnet in hand, the young man offers to let the protagonist test it. And as he said, if it were really a magnet, that little foot wouldn't have fallen to the ground. But yes, it would have stuck like other metal objects he placed to exemplify. With an explanation like that, all those who were questioning start to mock the hero. Then with a smile on his face, Jae Yun-ho just offers one more round to the boy. And Do-won Park, who is passing by, starts to pay more attention to the new client who is trying to expose him. After some time there, Jae Yun-ho comments that it really was quite fast, because in just a few minutes, the protagonist had already lost everything. Jo-young doesn't even know what is happening because he is sure he has about a 50% chance of winning, and this makes him think he might just be unlucky. Jae Yun-ho quickly asks if the boy has nothing else to bet, but the protagonist plays another one of his belongings, not caring that it is just a piece of paper. Suddenly, another person shouts that everything there is a big farce. And with a screwdriver in hand, he threatens the others, saying he's not stupid enough to be fooled. Obviously, the leader goes after him while the boy continues shouting for Muyo to return the money he lost. That's why Do-won Park holds his hand, remembering how happy he was while winning, and he slams his head against the wall, stating it's ironic that only when one loses do complaints arise. Do-won Park again asks if he has any evidence that there's a scam. The boy in turn tries to explain that the odds seem strange, but lacking any solid proof, Do-won Park warns that it will be problematic if he continues causing a ruckus, especially since this could affect other customers. Anyway, the gangster apologizes for what he did, saying it was only for security reasons, and then confidently he lets everyone continue enjoying their games, which again makes some prisoners agree with the den, calling anyone who questions a fool. After all, if he was angry about losing, he could resolve it by becoming better. Sometime later, in a private place, the main group gathers and Nam-gu asks how Ju-young did at the casino. Unfortunately, the hero reveals that all the money is gone and that, in the end, he couldn't find any evidence. However, he asks the same of his colleagues, and then the two start pulling something from inside their clothes. Nam-gu shows that they stole 2 cards, just as they had planned. The truth is that Ju-young had acted very well, drawing everyone's attention with that scandal, because it was only for that reason that they managed to steal the cards so easily from another table without a game. Nam-gu is very proud of his plan, unlike the hero who feels embarrassed. Anyway, if they are indeed cheating, they will be able to discover something with these cards. And Ju-young, even before checking, is sure that there must be something there. Sometime later, in that vocational training workshop, a loud noise is heard from the wheels of a speeding car. And beneath that car, the boy from before begs for forgiveness for his mistake. Do-won Park holds him there by the hair, asking once again if his den is a scam. People like him were the reason why baseless rumors spread. That's why, even with the boy shouting for the gangster not to cross the line, something quite problematic happens between the two there. After finishing that punishment, someone appears to talk to their leader. Jae Yun-ho apologizes but mentions a client named Ju-young who caused a commotion at his table. However, unlike the other, he claims it wasn't the boy's fault and asks not to worry about it. On the contrary, He asks the boy to keep working hard for his gambling den. Do-won Park thinks the protagonist must have some reason to show hostility towards the group he belongs to. He really doesn't care about being attacked, but his priority is the well-being of the casino. So from his expression, it's clear that he will take other measures if disturbed. Back in the main group's room, Nam-in-gu is pleased to announce that he found something. Although his colleagues can't see it yet, he can see very well. He can see that the scam is right behind the card he stole. When he looks closely at the pattern of the circles, he notices 2 of them are different sizes. Therefore, it's clearly a marked card, which can be identified by looking at the back. And having something like that in hand means the protagonist has finally found the so-called justification. However, in that car workshop, Do-won Park was also preparing for the possibility of another disturbance as an excuse to deal with Ju-young. It's a day like any other. Inmate number 2658 from the Juvenile Detention Center, Kim Jong-soo, is released, and as soon as he steps out, he is surprised because a person he doesn't know yet appears to congratulate him. He brings tofu to celebrate and asks if the boy had fun inside. Then, since Kim Jong-soo doesn't understand, the man comments referring to the fun he had gambling inside. And as the young man continues to act as if he hadn't done anything, the gangster shoves that tofu down his throat. Some time ago, he was a boy who was deep into gambling and heard the boss's proposal about lending money with a small guarantee in return. That guarantee, however, was now firmly in the hands of the gangster in front of him, and it was a consent form for organ extraction signed by Kim Jong-soo. At 1.74 meters and weighing 64 kilograms and not drinking or smoking, the boy had a quite healthy appearance. And the best part is that his blood type was O, so they had been waiting for him for quite some time. Kim Jong-soo, who had just been released from prison, tried to argue, but he was simply thrown into the back of a van. Hours later, the gangster comments that these young people are full of life, and therefore their organs are so fresh. Thanks to this, his business is growing so much that he even managed to get a new dental implant. All thanks to his dear Do-won Park, the organ trafficking agent who currently runs the gambling den. But changing the subject, the gangster asks how long his colleague intends to keep doing this. If he leaves any trace, someone could catch him, and since the director is extremely slippery, the blame will fall on Park. Still, even if he gets caught and the worst case scenario happens, he doesn't care. Because in his opinion, there is no problem in the world that money cannot solve. Back in the protagonist's cell, when they notice the marking on the letter, he realizes that the difference is so small that it makes sense no one has discovered it yet. Nam-in-gu asks if Meg Yeom also thinks he is so amazing since even he is impressed with how good an investigator he is. Anyway, now our hero has obtained the sword that could cut off all his enemies, so he made it clear that, even that night, they would go to the gambling den to settle unfinished business. In the vocational training workshop, moments later, Ju-young-cha returns with his head held high. Jae Im-ho is surprised that he is back, but had no idea about the plan. Going to the table, the hero asks if this is the place for the trump card and hears that it is. Then, in front of everyone, he sits down to expose how this place is manipulated. However, just as he was about to put his plan into action, Do-won Park appears and sits down too, saying he was waiting for him. Moreover, in a completely incomprehensible way, he offers to play around with him. Do-won Park comments that he is just curious to know why the protagonist is so obsessed with the celestial dragon. Jo-young-sha obviously does not share his personal matters with him. Then, the head of the workshop asks if the boy will change his mind if he asks for it, if he wins. And understanding that it might not make much difference, Jo-young-cha agrees. Many people gather, as the shop operator is personally involved in a round. And for something like this to happen, the boss kindly lets the protagonist choose the game. Since Jo-young-sha had already tried to play with dice, he tends to choose the trump card. However, Jae Yun-ho suggests a game where beginners can do well, like a memory game, where they turn over matching cards. If the player gets the same number, they can continue their turn, but if they make a mistake, the turn will pass to the opponent. The key is to remember the positions of the cards they have seen before, but since he knows about the marked cards, Ju-young-chae believes there is no way to lose. However, if he didn't know about the marked cards, he would be completely lost. Anyway, the operator of the gambling den, Do-won Park, and the leader of cell number 36 are announced for the current round. However, from a distance, Nam-in-gu asks his colleague if he is seen correctly, and the same doubt crosses the protagonist's mind because, for some reason, the marks on the back of all the cards had disappeared. Nam-in-gu asks if the marks are so small that they can't see them from the distance they are at. However, Meg Ji-young knows that the truth is that these cards are not marked. Perhaps knowing about the scheme, Do-won Park lets out an ironic chuckle and comments that it is quite a beautiful pattern of cards. After all, in the gambling den, they are meticulous and only use the highest quality decks. Moreover, they have many other games for beginners, so he lets Ju-young-chae choose another one if he wants. Ju-young-cha is shocked by the unraveling of the plan. Apparently, Do-won already knew they had stolen the cards from the beginning. Anyway, they continue commenting that they can play other games like Catch the Thief. And after this hint, Nam-in-gu asks if the protagonist is ready because in that case, they will place the bets. Taking the lead in this stage, Do-won puts a huge amount of money on the table to start. Since he doesn't play much as he operates the place, he believes it's a way to have more fun. Still, the protagonist comments that he has no money at all. But as they were already expecting this, Nam-in-gu reminds him that it is still possible to play with collateral. And for that, all he needs to do is sign the organ extraction document, marking the part of the body with the value he wishes to bet. However, at first the protagonist cannot react at all. Not just him, but the other people start to get scared that something like this is happening there. Then, Do-won Park mocks, asking if the boy is afraid to bet. Jae-yuma knows that there is definitely a scam going on in this game. And thank God they realize before betting. Nam-in-gu feels relieved to see that his colleague might back out. However, he notices that for some reason, everyone is starting to get scared. Joo-yeon-cha simply begins to sign that guarantee paper, even looking satisfied to be able to play by leaving this in exchange. Obviously, his colleagues start to panic over this madness. However, Joo-yeon-cha refuses to flee from that confrontation like a coward, and from the tips of his hair to the nails on his toes, puts everything on the line in the bet. After that bold bet, the hall falls silent for a few seconds, until it ends with Do-won accepting with pleasure. The hero's friends know well that there is a cheat involved, so they really can't understand what the hell Joo-yeon-cha is thinking now. Jae-yuma explains once again that in the memory game you must flip the cards to find those with the same number. It is the protagonist who will start the first turn. Joo-yeon-cha comments that he really likes the simplicity of this game, then flips a card with the number 8 and another with the number 9 printed on it. Since they are different numbers, the turn passes to Do-won to try his luck. As expected, the gangster coincidentally flips a 9, the same number the protagonist had just drawn. Then, remembering where the other one was, he flips the second 9 as well, which impresses everyone with this luck. As always in bets, all that matters is luck. For now, Do-won prepares the next move. Not even he believes it. After all, he already knew exactly where each card was placed, despite disguising it. For he had decided the arrangement of the cards with the judge and memorized all of them before starting to play. Thus, without evidence, this becomes a simple yet perfect way to cheat. In the end, he believes that Joo-yeon-cha will sit there oblivious until he loses everything he has, defenseless and pathetic. A long time ago, the boy's father asked why he liked him so much. Then, Do-won honestly replied that it was obviously because he made a lot of money. Because of that, he got a playful flick on the head as his father took it as a compliment. He felt proud to do his best for his son's sake, and he had the most secure and trustworthy posture of the world in Do-won's view. Or at least that's what he thought until then. Because in reality, his father didn't go to the company every day, but rather to the casino. And from what he heard later, he accumulated a debt of 50 million won with a loan shark. Falling like a fool into a trap by wanting to make his son happy and bring a lot of money home, the manipulated gaming system deceived him. However, having seen this up close today, Do-won does not consider himself stupid like his father. And having already matched several pairs of cards, he thinks he prefers to be the one who deceives. Back to what happens outside his head, people mock Joo-yeon-cha a lot for his bad luck. At this point for them, all that was left for the hero was to cry like a baby while his organs were being ripped out. However, Joo-yeon-cha asked if he should show everyone now. He asked if he should show everyone that this game is in fact manipulated. Unexpectedly, in his last attempt, the protagonist manages to lift 2 cards with the queen symbol. People start to think he is having a bit of luck, perhaps just coincidence. Even if God was smiling at him now, it would still take time to reach 16 pairs. However, he hits it right again and again, matching more and more pairs of identical cards. Then people begin to be baffled by how he is getting every single one right. 13 correct pairs had been drawn at once and the game was almost over. Do-won Park finally starts to feel fear because only he and the judge knew the positions of the cards. However, knowing this was already enough to reveal who had plotted against him. The day before, when they had finished the job, a note was left near where Nam-in-gu was. So, out of curiosity, he obviously picked it up to see what it was about. At that moment, he remembered when the protagonist, who had already lost everything, bet that piece of paper keep playing. And he opened it, realizing there was a message written saying to come to the back of the bathroom at a certain time. Perhaps by instinct, he went there to ask why the protagonist had called him. Then Joo-yeon-cha quickly replied that he knew about the cheating in the gambling den with the cards. Obviously, Nam-in-gu didn't confess right away to avoid facing the consequences. However, he knew that someone had stolen cards and that they had probably already swapped all of them for unmarked cards. That's why the protagonist called him there to be direct and offered the young man a chance to save himself. Both he and the other judges in the gambling den were working only to pay off their debts. Because when lending money, people put their organs up as collateral. In this case, Joo-yeon-cha made himself available to pay off his entire debt, as long as he helped him. Nam-in-gu was scared because if he sided with him and the plan went wrong, he would be killed. Joo-yeon-cha heard that the boy's debt was enormous and that he might not be able to pay it off when he was released. After all, from that day on, Nam-in-gu had only 1 week until he was sent away from jail. The protagonist truly doubted that he wanted to be dragged to an operating table the moment he regained his freedom. So he gave him a task as simple as rolling a pair of dice while lying down. All he needed to do was, when everyone was watching, expose the truth about the rigged games. Back in the present, after all that, the protagonist comments with a smile that his luck, it seems, is quite good. But while Do-won Park tries to understand, he corrects his statement, saying that perhaps his memory is good, since he memorized the position of all the cards that Do-won Park and his henchmen had predetermined. To make it even clearer, Nam-in-gu himself confirms the protagonist's position, revealing that, until now, all the games in the gambling den had been manipulated. Moreover, he also claims that he can show the prisoners all kinds of tricks that were used. This causes people to start to panic gradually and ask for some retraction from the boss. Do-won Park, trembling with rage, asks if they really said that his den is rigged. And with his expression bubbling with fury, he asserts that it is a ridiculous accusation. He tries to talk his way out of it, but Joo-young-cha doesn't give him time for that as he immediately slams his face into the ground. After all, this was already a plausible justification for doing so. Earlier, Do-won Park had made it clear in the manager's meeting that if frauds were discovered in his den, it could end him. So as the gangster himself said, Joo-young-cha was there ready to fulfill the consequence of that promise. Years ago, when the bills started piling up, the father knocked hard on the door for his son to open. He thought he had the right to be there after betting all that money. Do-won Park, who knew nothing of this, asked what his father meant by that. Ben, curled up on the floor, the man said he hadn't done anything wrong since Do-won wanted him to make money. He liked a father who made money, so he ended up in that situation. Sometime after this tragedy, due to the debts accumulated from gambling, his father became bedridden. And that was when Do-won began to realize the problem of the difficulties caused by not having money, since without it he couldn't protect his family. Back in the present, the protagonist continues his sentence saying that he will finish off the young man. However, when he was about to end everything with an attack that should crush him, he had an inconvenient surprise. Do-won had escaped from there, or at least that's what he thought, because suddenly he appeared from behind with a punch that sent Joo-young-cha flying. Besides betraying him, Nam-in-gu had also incriminated him as a swindler, so the boss made sure to grab him by the neck to make him pay a high price. Even while being choked, Nam-in-gu screams that he has the evidence that proves what he is saying. However, Do-won responds by asking where this supposed evidence is. To his misfortune, the other judge who worked with him was hiding the evidence at that very moment. So the boss manages to play the victim, saying that he is the one who should be angry and apply the proper punishment. Do-won would never have imagined that one of his own would conspire with a stranger to pay off his debts. On the other hand, the protagonist moves quickly, and the whole situation only reinforces his idea since everything happened because of money. He throws Nam-in-gu onto Joo-young and with clenched fists states that he will not judge him. However, he also says he has no intention of forgiving him for what he did. Literally, all the prisoners in the den began to panic, and this time it is Do-won who believes that the protagonist has escaped, leaving his accomplice there alone. However, the hero responds from behind him that he would never do something like that and kicks him so hard that he travels the entire space. After all, Joo-young didn't come there with the intention of fleeing or letting anyone escape. Back in the past, on that bed, the boy's father unfortunately had still not regained consciousness. Then Do-won told the doctor that apparently it was gambling that left him like that. No matter how much resentment he felt, the boy knew that his father carried many responsibilities. In the end, that was when he realized that without money, he couldn't protect his family and decided to pay off the debts with the same means that caused them. That day, the man behind the trafficking schemes claimed that the decision wasn't entirely his father's. And he said that was why taking care of a child alone was so difficult. Still, since the father had managed to pay off the debts, the thug questioned why he was still there in front of him. He asked if it was something like a son's love that motivated him. However, Do-won responded by asking how much that love would pay him. In the end, since he couldn't protect his family, he chose to sell it. Back in the present, he also shouts that he never thought about fleeing this fight, at least not if he couldn't take all his money with him. Joo-young dodges an attack and questions why he keeps talking about money. The protagonist quickly realizes that fighting doesn't seem to be someone like Do-won's strong suit. After all, every blow he lands hits and makes the situation uglier. However, Do-won still responds before taking another punch, asking if fighting is really that important. Nam-in-gu shouts and tries to warn, but the protagonist receives a knee to the stomach that makes him spit everything out. As if that weren't enough, while the boy tries to recover, he also sends him crashing into objects with a powerful left hook. For Do-won, idiots like the protagonist are only good for working under his orders and receiving their pay. So he asks again, furious if fighting is really the most important thing. Joo-young-cha ends the fight thrown against the windshield of one of the workshop's cars. Then people are disappointed that he acted tough and ended up like that. At this point, Nam-in-gu wanted to know what had happened to the boy. Do-won Park, for his part, apologized for the trouble he caused. But, as everyone could see, he said it was just an accident that had nothing to do with fraud in the den. He stated that they would soon reorganize things, but in the background, the hero spoke again. Joo-young-cha said he was wrong to accuse the gangster of rigging the bets and confessed that, for some reason, there was no reason to eliminate him. Even if he regretted it now, Do-won said it wouldn't make a difference. However, the protagonist said he didn't need a reason since that was a place for games. Because of that, from now on, he proposed that the two play a game of hide and seek. But this game wouldn't be just any game, because if he didn't hide carefully enough for Joo-young not to be able to find the boss's head, when he went after it and found it, he would rip it off as his great reward. Do-won Park starts to get up, saying he can't believe it. There was a mess everywhere, and that place was full of everything he had ever achieved. Then the boss shouted once more that he would not flee with his tail between his legs. However, he wasn't so lucky on the first attempt, as he was caught off guard by Joo-young, who said he was about to turn everything to ashes. In any case, the protagonist comments that he hates this game of tag. That's why he suggests, under free and spontaneous pressure, that they play rolling the dice, with the number showing on the top face being 3. Joo-young starts hitting the gangster, saying that 3 hits are his reward. Do-won Park questions, furious, how a boy dares to try to take him down by forcing such a scheme. Unlike the protagonist, he claims he is not a reckless person who throws punches without thinking. Moreover, he says he has great ambitions, but right in front of him, the dice are rolled again. Then all that boasting is cut short by the worry he feels. Especially since, although Ju-young understands that the boss might really have big plans, unfortunately, he is out of luck as the dice land on the face with 6 markings. Do-won Park screams, bubbling with rage for the boy to stop talking nonsense. However, the 6 blows are delivered just as agreed in the rules of the game, leaving the boss finished. In a tattoo parlor in the past, the tattoo artist was happy that the boy had gotten permission. At that time, tattoos of carp or monsters were popular among high school teenagers. So before lying down on the table, she asked what he would like to request. But without even thinking of any different option, he said he would like the dragon tattooed on her chest. The girl tried to play dumb, saying she was embarrassed by the stare. However, Do-won revealed that he knew she was a lookout for the celestial dragon, and that was precisely why he asked to be a part of it too. If he managed to gain the support of the celestial dragon to accelerate his plans, he would certainly bring in absurd amounts of money. The girl replied that she liked a man who risked his life more than his money. However, in this case, he stole her needle and said that for money, he could risk his life as many times as necessary, sticking it into his own neck. That was enough to convince the girl, so she asked what he wanted from them. And as his first request, he wanted to be sent to the juvenile prison where he is now. In the present, he screams for everyone to get out of his way. Do-won Park practically crawls on the ground, telling no one to dare block him. Although it is annoying, he understood that he would need to back off for now. However, all the evidence of fraud from the den had already been destroyed by his henchmen. Because of this, theoretically, the other cell bosses would come to his aid. At least that would happen if Ji-young hadn't recovered the evidence of the fraud. Then, with a piece of wood, he sent the leader flying away. Some people ask who that guy is, since all of his stuff is on the ground. However, Ji-young asked them to look carefully, because one of the judges was fleeing with those things, since they were precisely the evidence that this place was a fraud. Nam-gu becomes hopeful again, seeing that his friend can be useful sometimes. Anyway, the feeling of revolt among the prisoners begins to develop. However, Do-won Park seems to not understand his place. Even practically fainting on the ground, he continues to cling to his bills, because he only cares about protecting the money he earned with so much struggle. Then Ju-young-cha helps him by pouring a little gasoline on his clothes to cool him off. And after emptying the gallon, he announces the next game, and also the last one they will play. Regarding the name of this game, the protagonist likes to nickname it Try to Resist the Electric Shock. Since Do-won Park lost the last game, this would be his final turn, but the boss continues to worry only about the bills, shouting for the hero to stop. However, some time ago, he had already been warned about this, so he made sure to remind that all these achievements would turn to ashes now. The electric current is so strong that it leaks out of the stage. But before doing anything, the protagonist stares at Do-won Park, completely defeated on the ground. Perhaps from the shock of seeing his money being burned, he fainted. In the end, Do-won Park was totally beaten and defenseless, but that was not the main issue. In fact, the main issue was to see which of the prisoners would take the opportunity to get the money back. And to make Do-won's bad luck worse, that white-haired guy from the meeting was witnessing everything. So since his assumption had finally been confirmed, he would make sure to take the leadership from the gangster. A year and 2 months later, prisoner number 7849 is released. Do-won Park leaves prison knowing he may have failed in his main mission. However, he leaves with a smile on his face because, thanks to this, he learned to plan something bigger for the next time he started over. As soon as he exits, however, that dealer comes to greet him, just like he did with the others. And he also brings some tofu's, boasting about being the one who takes care of him. Do-won Park apologizes for not being able to provide goods from inside the prison, but claims he will get back on his feet. Hearing this, the dealer agrees with the young man's idea. But before that, he reminds him that he had borrowed money for his previous plans. In the end, both knew well that he had no money now, but they were professionals. And, as good professionals, they knew there could be another way to pay off this debt. Do-won Park, however, did not expect to be charged with such impatience. And to make matters worse, the dealer calculated the interest from that time until now and said that the amount had reached 1 billion. Therefore, instead of talking, he simply sent the former boss of the den into the van since his client was already waiting for him. Returning to the present time, Nam-gu had warned that Do-won was already out of the game. All of this, obviously, thanks to his sharp observation, but Ji-young also remembers that he helped. Anyway, the protagonist thought that with this, he had already crushed 3 of the seeds of the Celestial Dragon Gang. However, there was still another target to follow, and that perhaps had coincidentally appeared now. Inside the protagonist's cell, that white-haired boy was there for some reason. And as if that weren't enough, he asked, showing a picture of Ju-young if it was the girl next to him who died in the car accident. However, there wasn't even time to mock that because the protagonist flew at him with his right hand stuck to the boy's face. And besides that, when he threw it on the ground, he asked Nam-gu for a pillow. After all, he would need it so that no screams would be heard in the prison corridors. Before that, the white-haired one was in a cell that for some reason had various writings on the wall, all about someone's mother. So he found everything very boring and asked if there was something more interesting that would make his dopamine act. Anyway, it was also at that moment that, claiming it was quite easy to find them, they had an unexpected visit from the protagonist. He asked if this was where one of the seeds of that organization was, and since that was the case, he would have to deal with all those damn seeds in his own affectionate way. However, the white-haired boy was positively impressed because he had just reached the dopamine he needed. Back in the present, Ju-young-cha still smashes the boy's face against the wall and with his fists raised, says it's better to silence him since he's making too much noise. However, before landing the punch, something is placed right in front of his face. And even in that situation, the boy still mocks, saying it's a surprise. He had drawn a tattoo of a dragon and asked if the protagonist was looking for it. Therefore, using his body's momentum to his advantage, he escapes the hold, suggesting he could help. To get rid of those dragons one by one, the boy comments that they should clarify the misunderstanding. In fact, that photo had fallen from the sketchbook and had no malicious intent behind it. After all, in his opinion, he was a benefactor who wanted to help. Still, the protagonist just takes the photo from his hand and tells the prisoner to go away. However, the other responds that he thought he was smarter, but apparently he's more stupid than he seems. As he is a cell leader, he's free to fight as much as he wants there. But if he keeps going after others without thinking, he will end up dead at their hands. It is said that in juvenile prison there are guys much more dangerous than one can imagine. And so the boy asks if, still, the protagonist will refuse his help. Like it or not, he had appeared out of nowhere and making an unexpected proposal didn't seem trustworthy. Moreover, the hero was still trying to understand what the prisoner would gain by helping. To answer this doubt, Ju-Yong-cha asks what the messy-haired boy is thinking and what he really wants. Then, just like before, he replies that what he seeks is that explosion of dopamine. The next day, in the juvenile prison auditorium, several thugs gather and can hardly believe it. In a juvenile detention center filled with the stench of rough and rude boys, several girls had arrived. Because they were from the church, many of the prisoners with malicious thoughts praised the Holy Spirit. And, as expected from the great cathedral, they commented that their blessing was on another level. One of them tries to get in on the act, but even a prayer manages to go wrong. In any case, the fact that this event is promoted by the Cathedral of Heaven catches the protagonist's attention. A long time ago, in a similar cathedral, someone was singing for him to hide because they were going to look for him. It was his classmate, who was singing a typical hide-and-seek song. Her name was Daeun Lee, who was the protagonist's childhood friend until he was 17. Then, after walking a bit more, she managed to find the protagonist sitting there. That day, she had just caught him sleeping again, so he was a bit irritated, but the girl said it was cold to be there at night. Still, Ju-Yong-cha assured her that any place would be better than his home, which caused discomfort in the girl. Changing the subject, a sound of a door opening made the protagonist ask if she had brought someone. However, she denied it. That person was Luna, who was looking for her sister from the orphanage. Even before finding the two, Una shouted that if the girl was late, she would be reprimanded. Then the protagonist asked what Daeun was doing on top of him, but she assured him it was just to avoid being caught. Anyway, that memory ends, and back in the present, the thugs continue trying to suck up to the religious girls. One of them becomes more fixated on a certain girl who radiates light, has a sweet voice and celestial beauty. And when asked where she was, they replied that she was right in the middle, really looking like a saint. Then our hero was also surprised. After all, that girl there was precisely Luna Sung, with whom he had contact in the past. And just as he recognized her, when their eyes met, the girl also recognized Ju-Young. Later in the prison cafeteria, a girl calls her friend Umi, reminding her that they came there to spread the faith. However, based on the behavior of the prisoners, she does not believe there is hope for that. The way they look at the girls is like true predators. That's why some of them go to the nuns who are providing food, and one prisoner in particular hands over a box. With a subliminal message behind it, he maliciously licks a can. The two are afraid to know what is inside the boxes they received. Uni practically screams that they shouldn't continue helping these scum. Then her friend scolds her. Still, she maintained the opinion that feeding them would be a waste. To counter this stigma, Joseph Namgum was the next prisoner and thanked them for the food received. Obviously, he also thanked the sisters, wishing that grace would always be with them. Then the two began to think that Joseph might be Catholic. However, besides praying in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, he also prayed in the name of Buddha, which ended the thought that he was a religious person with a dogma similar to theirs. Finally, one of the girls wondered why Yuna was taking so long, since she had said she would just take a quick break. In a private place, the girl asked why the space was so cramped. And next to the protagonist, she also felt embarrassed, as it was a bit warm. Jo-yeon-cha, for his part, apologized, saying it was the only place he could go without being interrupted. Anyway, it had been a long time since they had talked like this, so it sounded a bit strange. After all, the three of them had a lot of fun together back in the day. Inevitably, the girl brings up the subject of Dae and Uni, recalling the moment she left them. And about this, the protagonist tries to say something. However, Luna interrupts him, saying she already knows they were always together and that it had always just been the two of them. But knowing this, she hugs him, saying she understands how difficult that time was. And no longer wearing that church mantle, she hints that it must have been lonely. Years ago at school, when Yuna passed by for the first time, the students said they had never seen anyone so beautiful there. But one of them already knew it was Luna Sung from the first year, even though that was the second floor. That's why they were curious to know who she'd gone to meet. Going up to the protagonist, she asked why he hadn't responded. Then he apologized, but it was bad that he hadn't even taken a look. Anyway, she still had many gift cards she received for her birthday and couldn't use them all by herself. So she suggested that Ju-young help her, but he refused, saying he had plans with Daeun. He apologized and left to resolve that matter the next day. Yuna then found herself alone, but from her expression, she didn't seem to have given up so easily. Returning to the present moment, Ju-young-cha was at a loss for words. So the girl commented, embarrassed, that she knows well how it feels to be alone in this world. But precisely because she knows this, she doesn't want to leave the protagonist alone and assures him she will be there to help. By the way, he still hadn't replied to any of her letters. So he apologized, as always, saying he was busy, and asked if something had happened. But the girl just laughed at how serious he continued to be while trying her best to show off her body. However, it was so he could read the writing on her tattoo well. A conversation outside about some Chief Kim interrupts the two. Guards hear that he is serving lunch and being starving, head over there. In this case, Anna remembers lunch and becomes desperate for having rested so much. So she says goodbye, saying it was good to see the protagonist after so long. And Joo-yeon-cha says the same, assuring her he will meet her outside in 3 years. However, about that, the girl warns that it won't be necessary because she will be back next week. From now on, the Cathedral of Heaven will make regular visits every Sunday. And for her, this will be great since they will be able to see each other more often. Later, the same question arises if the prisoners liked it, and dressed in an apron, she offers to clean up the mess. The bums behave somewhat politely, saying that as trash, they should take care of it, but she doesn't consider herself superior. Anyway, all that boring conversation discussed the other girls, until one of them speaks loud enough for the protagonist to hear that the girl is flirting. One comments that Yuna has the courage to act like that with criminals, and the other nearly vomits. In the end, they conclude that that rumor about the girl must be true, a certain rumor about her recently visiting motels. So the two mockingly comment that she is definitely a saint, but a saint of love who adores lust. In a later sermon, a missionary lady cries out to the Lord for her need. Then the prisoners joke that they are also in need, and this time they don't even try to believe in God. Finally, John 8:29 is recited with the fateful phrase, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Anyone can be freed from sin in the truth and love of God, which means they can be free. And so, just for today, this nun decided that the prisoners would be free to enjoy a good performance. Then, all those opportunistic thugs began to believe in God again as if by magic. Without those heavy missionary outfits, the girls from the cathedral were more relaxed and exposed. So, as they performed a sort of dance, those thirsty prisoners obviously began to worship. Even more so when they realized that the saint was participating in the midst. One of those filthy thugs said some rude things about her beauty. Then another prisoner teamed up with this thug to go to the bathroom and then stop by their break room to do something funny. Later, when the show ends, one of the girls confides in the nun that she couldn't hear anything due to all the noise. Anyway, Minji Kim was dressed in pink and playing with another colleague. Then outside, those prisoners started to get excited. And from what they had already heard, they were eager to see colors of other things too. How they could get there? Maybe they could, but fortunately, the protagonist was there to show them the red they would see in hell. But before doing anything, someone did it for him and resurrected the 7th of the 10 Commandments. Joseph Nangbang recited, "You shall not commit adultery," crushing those two scoundrels for the sin they were about to commit. And for the blasphemy against the name of God, he also warned that he would not forgive them. When the door opens, the girls inside the locker room are confused. Yuna quickly goes to the protagonist to ask what is happening. However, before hearing the answer, she figures it out for herself upon seeing the bodies of the two thugs on the floor. At that moment, she goes behind the boy who asks if she is scared, and Yuna simply offers sincere apologies. A week later, at another one of those services, the nun speaks again about how God can forgive sinners. Meanwhile, in the donation warehouse, transporting the donated goods was proving quite difficult. And to make matters worse, there was a group of 3 armed prisoners behind him, lying in wait. Although they had been discovered, it was too late to react, so one of them lunged with a knife. Soon the other 2 did as well, trying to stab the protagonist together. However, using one of the water bales to defend himself, Joo-yeon-cha simply responds that the heavens may punish them for this. After all, like it or not, they just damaged donated goods. Anyway, the protagonist crushes the bale, soaking all 3 of them. And while they are dazed, he goes behind them, saying he knows they are not the ones behind this. So he simply knocks all 3 to the ground and with a frightening expression asks who is the mastermind. However, at that moment, the storage room door is opened by one of the guards who questions what they are doing there. And to make matters worse, he notices that one of the missionaries is huddled in the corner of the storage room. Even the protagonist is startled as he hadn't seen her there. Given her condition, he begins to panic, thinking they had done something to her. However, the unexpected happens as Luna points to Joo-yeon-cha and says that he was the one who harmed her. A phone conversation asked how much a person charged, and it was agreed that she would send photos at 7 o'clock, which pleased an older man. A girl who was already there said that this man could no longer change his mind. It was Yuma, who, charging 500,000 won, asked if he would really give that money. To which the man replied that yes, after all, he had enough to burn. Anyway, he began to focus on, saying how beautiful she was and that she should thank the heavens. Moreover, he also asked her to sit next to him, since apparently he didn't know how that would work. However, at that moment, a huge noise cut through their conversation and someone as big as him entered through the door. The man desperately questioned who it was, and this man judged it as an illegal meeting. On top of that, from someone who claimed to be a pastor of a church. Even trembling, the pastor asked if he was really being threatened by the two, because he was very influential, but still received a punch right in the face, and several others right after, which for the man was not a problem, since with that behavior, he was not a pastor of a church, but rather of a cult. There was also a hidden camera in Yuna's bag which had been recording everything. However, even so, the large man told the pastor not to worry, because they would make an agreement to keep that wrongdoing confidential for a reasonable amount in the name of the heavens. A long time later, in a distant place at the storage prison, the inmate Joo-yeon-cha was sentenced to 10 days of confinement in a solitary cell. That same guard asked the young man whether he had done something similar during a visit. He was already aware that the boy had been receiving special treatment from the director. However, since this time it involved someone from outside, the confinement was unavoidable. Furthermore, even the Ministry of Justice was monitoring the security cameras. So the guard explained that he could not allow him to leave and had to go, but not without expressing indignation while wondering how he could have done something so unacceptable inside a prison. Unexpectedly, on the previous day, his former friend had accused him of having taken certain wrongful actions against her, so he was still wondering why Yuna would do something like that. In the afternoon, it was volunteer day at the church, and after the event's commitments, in the youth prison parking lot, someone commented that it seemed to be God's will that they met again. After all, Joseph Nangung remarked that it had been a long time since he had seen Sister Yuna. She had heard that the place was corrupt, but had not imagined it would be to such an extent, to the point that an inmate could be wandering around there. Joseph said that the leaders of the cells in that prison paid a monthly fee to the director, which ensured a certain level of freedom. But even if that were not the case, he stated that being with Yunha was worth the sacrifice. Moreover, speaking with her, they reminded him of the old times when they conducted judgments of dissenters as true companions. Although his methods had been somewhat harsh and he had been accused of 30 cases of serious misconduct. Anyway, she had always been his reliable assistant, which was why he had asked for her help with this matter, to once and for all be able to deal with the problem concerning Jiang Cha. Back at that prison, no matter how much the protagonist thought, he truly could not understand. The circumstances, it seemed that someone had tried to set a trap for him. Those who had tried to intimidate him in a larger group with improvised weapons had merely been a distraction to buy time, and the real objective was to use Yuna to accuse him of attempting to harm a woman. However, in the end, at the most critical moment when the girl went to speak to the guard, she changed her mind and said that she had been saved. Yuna accused the three of having dragged her to the place to harm her and presented Juyang as the hero. Then, at first, the guard simply asked his colleagues to take everyone outside, and this made the protagonist wonder how Yuna had ended up being used by someone. Who that person might be, he did not know, nor did he understand why she had changed her mind at the last moment. In the present, the protagonist called the officer saying he had a request to make. The guard obviously said that it could not be anything noticeable because of the security cameras, but the protagonist explained that he only wished for him to call someone to come there. Back in the parking lot, Joseph commented that on the first day the girl had visited the prison the previous week, she had hidden behind someone to avoid him, and he had noticed it when he saw her. He realized that she had already been influenced by that dissenter boy. Precisely because of that, he had given her an opportunity to judge him directly with her own hands. However, shortly after praising her so much, she asked why she had not done so. Yuna asked, trembling, whether they could stop those judgments. She recalled that she had done everything he requested outside the prison until then, so the man asked whether she had forgotten that he still possessed those recordings. Since she had done well so far, all she needed to continue doing was to help as she always had. Moreover, he also mentioned the girl's mother, which was the final straw that made her stand and threaten to report him. Yuna shouted that he had committed offenses and other things, but she was restrained immediately without even having the chance to contest. And with the girl held down, Joseph called her a corrupted dissenter. However, he also told her not to worry, because he would purify her with a special method at that very moment. Yuna cried out in despair as if she were about to die, but the man did not care since there was no one around to hear them. It was exactly the two of them there, and everything was unfolding for the worst, until the bus door shook and caught Joseph's attention. Slowly, a person begins to climb the steps of the vehicle, and the girl's crying comes to an end. At the end of that corridor, Juyang appears outside his solitary cell, determined, and then Joseph asks how he got there. He doesn't understand how the protagonist managed to get out of where he was. But, in any case, still on top of the girl, he asks him to wait a minute because there's something he needs to finish. And instead of shouting at Juyang, he simply presses the emergency button on the bus, causing the doors to close, because he was also about to start and finish what he came to do there. In that earlier conversation with the guard, when the person he called went there, she was confused. The boy with white hair was jealous that he had gotten a private room. He said he also wanted to go in there, but Juyang stated that he didn't want to play. In fact, the protagonist remembered that the boy had said before that he wanted to help because he was his benefactor, so he was demanding now, and he wanted proof of how the messy-haired one could help with anything. In this case, all that casual talk went away, leaving only one question. He wanted to know what he needed help with, but he needed to know every detail. Back in the present, the girl finds the protagonist again, and both seriously and angrily, he tells Joseph to get away right now. The prisoner's response is a joke about it being a religious activity. Then, even angrier, Juyang shouts that he's telling him to leave. And in that case, Joseph really stands up, saying he already mentioned it was just a religious activity. And he also mocks, saying it's hard for heretics to understand. Juyang moves first, not letting the enemy take advantage with a powerful punch to the gut, and then tells him to stop talking nonsense because, just for what he did to Yuna, he has already committed enough sins to deserve to be torn apart alive. Juyang Cha unleashes a flurry of punches against that criminal until all his clothes are torn. But Joseph remains firmly standing without any damage to the human wall. He concedes, curiously praising the protagonist for being the first to attack only the vital points. But Juyang Cha responds with a kick, saying he won't explain anything to the criminal. Then Joseph first explains about his strength, but he says he didn't learn it from humans because, in his opinion, what he possesses was solely granted by God. After all, this is a blessed body, and he decides to prove it with his next punch, which makes the bus shake like an earthquake, revealing the face of God's angel, which to the girl's despair makes her friend fall to the ground. Joseph claims to be the one in charge of judging heretics and also asks if it's not true to affirm himself in front of his sister Ilna, a long time ago at the summer Bible camp for kids. Currently, Luna said she was living separately from her family because of debts, but by the grace of God, she prayed that one day she could be able to live with her mother again. Many thought she was amazing for not only having separated from her mother due to the debt caused by her father, but also for paying everything on her own. So they also felt compassion and prayed for her well-being. Later, in one of the camp corridors, the one who had been listening to everything before introduced himself, saying Amen. It was already late afternoon when he called the girl's name. Joseph introduced himself, saying he was one of those who participated in the Bible camp the previous week, and by a twist of fate, he heard about the unfortunate circumstance of his sister. Regarding the debts, he then said that there might be a way to help with that. A quick way to pay off such a large debt piqued her curiosity, especially since Joseph was proposing something he considered benevolent, wanting to judge the heretics, and from what he had already seen of her, the boy believed that Yuna had the perfect qualifications to help him. Returning to the scene on the bus with the heretic who seduced his sister in hand, Joseph prides himself on practically already coming out victorious and prepares to judge him mercilessly. However, he receives a strong blow to the back of the head, along with an embarrassed shout from Yuna, who with a simple umbrella tells him to stop that. Finally, he tightens the protagonist's shins and throws him away with force until he hits his head and makes the bus windshield crack. Anna can barely contain her worry, but she had another bigger problem to face, and it came in the form of a slap. And despite considering her corrupt now, Joseph again told her not to worry because he was about to start the purification. Before that, however, suddenly a chill runs down his spine and he falls to his knees, unable to control his body very well. The situation gets so bad that he starts to spit blood all over the bus floor. Then to explain, the protagonist comments that the prisoner himself had said earlier he had praised him for targeting his blows only at vital areas. Therefore, even with a blessed body, he probably cannot withstand internal injuries. Joseph also argues that the protagonist does not seem to be in good condition. However, in his view, that is nothing to worry about. At least it is nothing compared to the pain his child and friend has endured so far. With some cleaning products by his side and the enemy in front of him, he claims to have made a decision. Joyeon-cha insists that people like him who commit sexual crimes should be punished physically and also chemically. In other words, what he is proposing is a homemade castration procedure on the scumbag. In a memory, before they were in that juvenile prison, the protagonist asked if she wasn't being a bit exaggerated. However, the girl said no, as it was just one of the valleys she had arranged last time. Anyway, her expression didn't look good, so he asked if the girl wasn't enjoying the food. But that wasn't it. In fact, what bothered her was realizing that everyone around her had mothers except for her. In this case, the protagonist commented that it didn't matter much because he also didn't have a mother. And even if a little boy had made a fuss about it, he didn't think it was that hard to live like this. Anyway, the girl cut him off, reminding him that they had made a promise that she would definitely come back. And then she asked if the boy knew the meaning of her tattoo. "I will keep waiting for you." That was the message she intended to write on her chest, out of love for her mother. Returning to the current moment inside the bus, the protagonist asks Loma to hold on just a little longer, because it won't take long to end all that confusion. And as he said before, the punishment for that criminal right in front of them would be done so that he would never repeat any of his dirty actions again. Joseph, for his part, shouts that it is frustrating to hear this because he doesn't do anything dirty, but he simply attacks the protagonist, knowing that explaining himself doesn't matter. After all, he himself gets tired of pretending to be a religious man when he is nothing of the sort. However, once again, that chill from before returns. His internal damage starts to worsen as time passes. Then the protagonist asks if he still hasn't understood that the more he moves, the more damage he will receive. The two exchange punches, hitting each other with as much force as they can muster. Joseph tries to understand how the damage from the attack can get even greater. But regarding that, the protagonist says he can go ahead and test it. An intense punch contest begins between these two powers of the juvenile prison. More and more, the confrontation proves to be fierce, but Joseph feels the impossible happen when his body can no longer take it. And if he unfortunately reached this point, all he could do was use Luna as bait. However, for someone who claimed to have a blessed body, the protagonist found it amusing that the only response he found was to use a hostage, and he simply punished that repugnant idea with a kick to the scumbag's face. Joyeon-cha comments that it had been a long time since he fought someone his size. That's why it took some time to adjust, but compared to a certain someone, Joseph was nothing. Finally, the tables turn with the criminal fallen on the bus floor. However, he starts to laugh for some reason. Joyeon-cha asks the reason for the laughter, and the boy remembers that he still has all the videos of the crimes he committed with her back then. And for that reason, he asks what would happen if the mother found out what her beloved daughter had done. That she had been pretending to sell her own body was actually a criminal extorting money through threats. Joseph is really excited to know what kind of expression the mother will make. However, the protagonist does not back down and tells him to go ahead, because so far there have been 5 charges of sexual assault, in addition to 9 attempts and 4 harassments. Precisely all the crimes he committed that were still not revealed. But Joyeon-cha assured that he would expose each of them to the public. And also, if he was going to be threatened, he asked, with the taser in hand, that he at least do it right. The criminal screams, desperately asking how he has a stun gun. However, right in that critical spot for men, he is hit, starting the electric current. Just as the protagonist had said, since he gave his word that he would never be able to repeat those dirty actions again. Joo-young-cha had already been through something similar before, but as the shock hit right at that moment, the other probably could no longer act like a man. So even without using other methods that could indeed be called castration. Finally, after that frightening conflict, Anna runs after the protagonist, shouting in concern. And she also apologizes for what he had to go through because of her. However, the hero responds by asking if it is really time to worry about him. Joo-young-cha wanted to know why she hadn't said before that she was being threatened like that. But about that, instead of answering right away, she first asked, playing with her hair, how he had gotten there. Then Joo-young said that she had an interesting habit. Usually when she tried to hide something, she had the habit of playing with her hair. But since she only realized that now, she apologized once again. Anyway, the protagonist helps her with a cut on her face, which obviously makes her embarrassed. Vanna tries to say that it's nothing serious, and Joo-young can hardly believe all of that. So from now on, he asks her to never do something so dangerous again. And feeling what it is like to have someone who cares, the girl not only blushes with embarrassment, but is also very happy with the gesture. Suddenly, another noise interrupts their conversation. In front of that bus, a person greets the young couple. This person is the same one with messy hair from before who, for some reason, is at the wheel. He humorously comments that the protagonist is making him feel like a lonely bachelor. Anyway, it's hard to know why he is revving the engine out of nowhere. However, the young man didn't want to know anything other than stepping on anything to see what would happen. And this was to avenge all the people in this world who were single like him. More precisely, those who wished that all couples would be thrown together into hell. It is explained that gangsters use various ways to get rid of corpses. Some bury their enemies in cement, others throw them into the sea or even inside cemeteries. And all of these are effective methods to eliminate traces. However, the operations chief of the Celestial Dragon, Gang Shin-ju, the right-hand man of Gang Ryeon, does not find this necessary. The method of his gang is to ensure that reuse is possible at any time when needed. And that is exactly why they chose preservation by freezing. Finally, before proceeding with the method, it is asked if the one going through this wants to say anything. Then the man questions who gave the order and states desperately that the Alliance will not forgive the selfishness of the Celestial Dragon. He says that if they don't stop now, it won't be long before they are swimming in a pool of feces. However, how things will end is something he can only discover by watching from the inside. Thus, the young man is thrown inside by Kang Shin-ju without a hint of remorse. At a certain moment, a call from the detention center comes to his cell phone, and he promptly answers, identifying himself as the operations chief. Whoever is on the other end gives the news, but the young man really can't believe they are true. Back in that chaos on the bus, the protagonist continues not understanding what's happening. If they kept going like this, at this pace, something horrible would happen. Besides the risk of an accident, they would consider that they were trying to make an escape. The one with messy hair, on the other hand, didn't care at all about that and demonstrated it by making a totally reckless drift, which obviously led that bus to crash into the wall of the detention center, creating a crack. Joo-yeon-chae quickly goes to see if her friend is okay and furious shouts at her colleague, asking if he is crazy for doing that. However, the messy-haired young man murmurs something low into the airbag, and since the protagonist doesn't understand, he repeats, telling the two to run from there. In fact, the young man doesn't even wait, but rather pushes the two out of there before the guards arrive. After a few minutes and all those problems, the officers had already left. And in a genius plan, now that pervert would be treated as guilty for trying to escape, without even being able to use the security cameras to clear himself. Everything went perfectly, so having reached his time, the messy-haired one said goodbye, but not before wishing the two a good time with a hint of mischief. Changing the subject, Judong warns Yuna that they must be looking for her. So she understands that she needs to leave, but before she remembers that she was forgetting the most important thing. She believes that the protagonist should keep a certain thing, a kind of keychain of a cute bear with a bow, which by the hero's expression, despite being something simple, has some significance. Some time ago, in a well-known gaming house, Daeon had won 3 times in a row, right on a machine where she said she was bad and managed to get 3 of those as a reward. Yuna practically urged the hero to try again, but he couldn't get anything. So since he had 3 keychains, Daeon thought it made sense to gift one to each of them. After all, the most logical thing was to share among people without family like them. After all, as the two already knew with this they could be together no matter where they were. In this case, the keychains would be a symbol of that promise. But although Anna liked the idea, Juyong found it the most cringe thing in the world. Still, he decided to keep it because, in Daeon's view, the more he looked at the doll on the keychain, the more he thought it resembled her. What was given to Juyong-cha now Yuna had found while tidying up her friend's room. And since the keychain would represent the union of the 3, Juyong felt a certain nostalgia. To add, Yuna explained that it had been on her desk, where it was easier to see. So remembering what she said about being similar, Juyong agreed that the bear looked like it could be as disobedient as Daeon. Anyway, the time finally comes for Anna to leave and she says her goodbyes. But instead of leaving normally, the girl runs out, which makes the protagonist find this behavior strange. Yuna had, in fact, had to run because she was very embarrassed. In the end, she couldn't say anything, but at least she was loyal to her friend's memory. However, next time, Lumna assured herself that she wouldn't blame herself for confessing that she liked Juyang. Later, in one of the cells of the juvenile detention center, the news was being updated. The messy-haired one made a point of commenting on how Joseph was now a eunuch. He still couldn't believe that the protagonist had used a 1 million-volt stun gun in that place where everyone knows. Joyeon, for his part, asks why the guy is there, then he reveals that he got into trouble to come keep him company. And before the next question, he confesses that being interrogated is quite exciting. Anyway, the protagonist asks how the hell his colleague managed to get him out of solitary confinement. After all, the prison officer clearly said that this place was being monitored, and not only did he free him, but he also managed to borrow a taser. But since he was also the one who reported Joseph's crimes, the protagonist asks for his identity. However, despite having dealt with the interrogation so far, the boy decided to keep it a secret, and in any case, he had clearly already proven himself. Therefore, the protagonist rewarded him with a ring that made him punch the air in joy. Getting straight to the point, the hero asks what kind of help his new ally wants. However, silence fills the room as soon as he finishes speaking, because unbelievably, at the moment of receiving his reward, the messy-haired guy had fallen asleep. Joyeon felt powerless in the conversation, but under the moonlight of the night, he took that bear keychain given by his old friend, determined to do something. That same night, a little way from the solitary confinement of just a while ago, a luxury car approaches through the forest. And from there, a woman steps out, relieved not to have died on the trip. This is Haiwen Yu, an associate of the Celestial Dragon and a close associate of Gang Rayon, and now she's really curious to know why he built the Celestial Pavilion on top of the mountain. For the girl, the guy could have simply bought a luxury building in the city center, being the number 2 of the gang. In any case, she was sure he had a peculiar taste. So she quickly entered the meeting room, saying she had come as fast as she could. However, when she realizes what is happening, she apologizes. There were already many wreckages scattered on the floor, and yet she hadn't realized before entering that he was training. However, Gang Shinju serves a cup of tea, explaining that they just finished. Despite complaining a little earlier, Haiwen comments that the journey was great with the fresh mountain air. Then the boss says he is glad to hear that, but goes straight to business, asking if he needs to hear something. Therefore, Gangshin reveals that he has news about the young master. And by Raon's expression, it is clear that he does not intend to take this matter lightly. In the Celestial Pavilion, which is the NX region of Raon, in a more appropriate location shortly after, the three gather to discuss, because the boss in particular is curious to know more about his son. Gangshin explains that after the young master entered juvenile detention, he had several confrontations against cell leaders, and as expected, he defeated all of them, who coincidentally were seeds of the Celestial Dragon. So since he won at an incredible speed, one could say that Juyang was at a high level. What Haiwen Yu agreed on, excited and embarrassed for having thought that others were promising. In her mind, it was clear that the father must be proud of his son's growth. But for Raon, at that moment, he could not even be considered a sprout, let alone a flower. In fact, he would only be a shoot, the first stage of a plant when it spreads its roots. It had been some time since he entered prison, but he had only faced a few leaders. And in the chief's view, if he were indeed his son, he would have shown more noteworthy achievements. So to give that little help that was missing, the chief states that they should put into practice the method to advance the blooming. Back to the daily life in prison, 3 students are startled by a scream. They even try to understand what they heard, but Yuntek Choi orders them to burn, as he had already said. Everyone tries to say it was just a joke, but talking without acting is something that deeply irritates the prisoner. Before being imprisoned, he was a normal high school student, or maybe not so normal, since he showed everyone how to discipline someone. More specifically, how to discipline his teacher, Mr. Kim. From what he had analyzed, the teacher was the type who talked without acting, so he made sure to keep the talker quiet in his own way. At another moment, other victims of his could barely respond, but Yuntaek ordered them to stand up. In the end, he ended up in prison for disobeying court orders and reacting with aggression. Back to the present moment, a subordinate comments that he has some news about the newcomer. After passing it on, what reaches Yuntaek is that Juyang thinks he is the king of the jungle. So as he usually does, he decides it's time to show the boy his place. In another district of the prison, in the protagonist's cell, Namingu pulls a gesture of respect for his master who returned, which the others copy. Everyone got into the groove treating the protagonist like a lord, even though he finds it embarrassing. Anyway, Jaema comments that the protagonist looks good and he returns the compliment. Jaeyoung asks, but from what he heard from his friend, nothing happened while he was away. However, the hero notices that among the prisoners in his cell, one face is unfamiliar. Therefore, Namingu comments that the new guy seems very dumb, but he is a good person. Suddenly, a guard appears knocking on the door of cell number 36. He informs that everyone will be working outside in the afternoon and that they need to be ready in 5 minutes. Back in the cabin of the Celestial Dragon Chief, it is said that, in ancient times, they did something called poison jar. It would fill a jar with a bunch of poisonous insects and make a meal out of it. Thus, perhaps the last survivor could acquire poison skills. Similarly, in the juvenile prison, in an analogy, insects are being placed in a jar. Therefore, Ryong's son is forced to devour them to become even stronger. Haiwen was curious about these poisonous insects, but the chief explained that he had already put one in there. By the way, a very strong poisonous insect. Returning to the prison, Yuntaek hears the news that the entire cell of the protagonist is working behind Building 5. So he finds this perfect, as he is furious about how confident the protagonist is acting. Yuntaek has definitely had enough of this. In this case, his subordinate asks what he will do, but the guy doesn't care about the hero's status or needing a justification. In fact, Yuntek has already made up his mind that today would be Juyong's last day. Elsewhere in the prison, red stains cover the body of prisoner number 7199. Juyong is found lying on the floor like this by his friends who scream in despair. Namin asks what happened for his chief to be bleeding, and the protagonist gets up, causing even more scares, but explains that, in fact, he is tired of trying to clean the red paint that stained his clothes. Anyway, the day ends with a lot of work. Namin-gu feels his body sore, and another from the cell comments that they should complain to human rights. However, the conversation is interrupted when the group notices more of that red color on the floor of the corridor. Namin asks if someone is painting around there too. However, the protagonist realizes that it is not paint, and soon his colleague also panics. After all, what was giving that color to the floor was the chief of cell number 37. This was the beginning of Rao's plan, who was eagerly waiting for his son to bloom like a flower and make him proud. However, he also had the notion that Juyong should be as careful as possible, because there was some chance of having its roots cut before reaching full maturity. And as previously mentioned about those poisonous insects, the chief made sure to place one of the best there, and with such care that they weren't quite noticing where the enemy was. Anyway, the protagonist's father's desire now was to test Juyong, to see if he would also be able to survive this new challenge. Some time ago, in cell number 36, the place was undergoing another major change, as they had to welcome a newcomer who didn't seem friendly at all. While some were scared because it was just when Juyong went to solitary, others were impressed. The fact was that he looked exactly like a guy who was causing trouble outside. That's why Namin-gu asked, worried what made him get arrested. Everyone was speculating about some kind of special robbery or perhaps murder. However, when they thought he would answer, the boy shouted a nonsensical onomatopoeia, and he kept shouting strange and crazy things like tweet tweet, chirp chirp. At least that's what they thought, because the one making those noises was a little sparrow he brought with him. The boy said he found it nearby, but was asked why he brought it. Then he explained that he felt bad for the abandoned little animal, even though this wasn't a nest. The little bird started to fly, and the boy ran after trying to catch it any way he could. In the end, Namin dismantled the first impression that the new member would be different from a loser. However, Jayam continued observing from afar, curious, still not making hasty decisions, because coincidentally, that boy's sparrow landed exactly in the top drawer where Juyong's personal belongings were kept. Back to the present, in the bathing area, Namin comments that it's hard to believe all this is happening after the hero's solitary confinement. When that leader was taken to the hospital, he apparently had 23 fractures in his body. Namin feels scared just thinking about how long it will take to recover, and with no security cameras, the question remains, who could have done this? Definitely, that new boy in the cell is seen as a possible suspect by Juyam. While they were painting the prison walls, even if just for a moment, there was someone who didn't see the boy with them. Moreover, he had a red stain on his shoes that from Juyam's personal experience didn't seem to be paint. Putting this together with the scars on the novice's body, there was a good chance they were traces of some recent fight. Noticing his colleague distracted, Juyong calls him to leave soon. But this ends up being a cue for the bald guy to say what's on his mind. Namin is the first to make the suspicious hint public, the fact that the novice is covered in bruises and heavy scars. That's why, once again, they ask if he is part of some gang and what he did before coming there. Then the boy replies that they are just marks from the beatings he received from his father when he was younger. However, this excuse only makes the protagonist more worried. Years ago, just before physical education class in the 5th period, while some were looking for borrowed uniforms, most stopped changing because of what they were seeing. That student in the back was Juyeon Cha, known in the neighborhood for being beaten by his father, who was part of a dangerous gang. Some thought he should report it, but it was a consensus that the father was probably so scary that he couldn't. Anyway, the hero's classmates felt bad that he had to live in such a lamentable situation. At bath time, the prisoners comment on that big guy down below, comparing sizes. Anyway, normal men's conversations happen, but Jiyoon doesn't let the atmosphere relax. In fact, he remains focused and for a second, thinks he might be mistaken, but all those scars on the novice's body draw attention. Even the protagonist becomes thoughtful. Then the boy breaks the mood by asking for some shampoo, which Juyong hands over without problems. That's why the boy asks, curious if the protagonist happens to feel sorry for him. However, the hero responds by asking if he seems like someone capable of feeling sorry for that, especially because, from what has been said so far, both had equally lamentable lives. Anyway, the protagonist says goodbye, telling the colleague to leave when he's done. However, a few minutes later in the bathroom, while drying off, the boy asks to make a question. The novice asks where all the other cellmates went, and the hero replies that he sent them out first, and about why he did that. Juyong asks if the boy doesn't also agree that something very strange is going on, until because the shape of the scars on his body coincidentally resembled those on the protagonist's body. For a second, silence fills the room. The boy even tries to explain himself, but at that very moment, Juyong throws himself at him, pinning his head to the ground with force. And with his hands around his neck, he prepares to strike, saying there's no way this can be a coincidence. Regardless of how he sees it, for the protagonist, it's clear that these scars were made by his father. Since the newcomer had no tattoos, he wasn't recognized at the time, but now it was certain that it was the Gangryong clan who sent him. Naturally, the boy stayed quiet, and the protagonist was already expecting such a reaction. That's why he told him to keep his mouth shut if he could, because he doubted he would be able to continue like this for long. Back at the Celestial Dragon Clan complex, but a few good years ago, Haiwen reported that she had fulfilled a request to bring a bunch of talented boys there. Everyone there could be called emerging talents for the future, and she selected those who had no owner. Obviously, this was something that even the Celestial Dragon didn't know, so Ryong could use them however he saw fit. The expression on those boys' faces was pure fear, and for a second the chief analyzed what his subordinate had done. However, he questioned the fact that they had been chosen since, in his view, they were all just trash. It was clear that none would be able to kill a single person, and what he needed was a hunting dog capable of tearing apart its prey. That's why he asked to keep only the biggest one with the clan and simply throw the rest away. Haiwen really asked if he was serious, since she had worked hard to choose them. But since the chief didn't pay attention, one of the boys jumped on the big guy, sinking his teeth into his neck. And by doing that without hesitating at all, the chief smiled because those were the eyes of a fierce dog he was looking for. Therefore, from that moment on, that child was allowed to call Round father. Back in the present, after being pressed against the wall, the newcomer starts to speak. And without much beating around the bush, he reveals that he is that person's hunting dog, which makes the protagonist curious but also worried. He found it strange that the boy had no tattoos, so he wouldn't be an affiliate of the Celestial Dragon, but rather a personal choice of Ryong. Anyway, the protagonist continues to press the suspicious colleague against the wall in this type of interrogation. And since he is the hunting dog, he asks why they are in the same cell. Moreover, he wants to know why he eliminated the leader of Cell 37. Even having so many opportunities to attack, the boy stayed observing from afar. All of this made Juyong want to know immediately why Ryong had put him there. The boy continues to say nothing, with his neck squeezed by the protagonist's hands. However, Juyong finally loses his patience and starts to squeeze harder. With both hands, he questions whether the boy will remain silent until the end and begins dragging him along the walls of the place, breaking everything at an insane speed. Until he ends up throwing the newcomer into another corner of the bathroom, with even more force than before. He starts to bleed, and the protagonist doesn't even think about releasing the boy's neck. Those damn memories of when he was a child and got beaten by that man were resurfacing. Then the hero's gaze showed an insane thirst for blood, which manifested through the strength of his hands. This would be the boy's last chance to give a convincing enough explanation. However, just at the moment he thought he would have an answer, Juyong realizes that the so-called spy had fainted. He had many chances to avoid it, but for some reason he still didn't resist. That's why the protagonist's curiosity about his father's plans reaches another level. The next morning, that sparrow starts the day by eating and making a lot of noise. Then, another cellmate tells the animal to go away, saying he's about to go crazy. Joyeon, for his part, continued to feel something strange. He had observed for several days after the incident, but couldn't perceive any suspicious behavior. On one of those planned occasions, Nam-in-gu pretended to trip to throw his food tray on the newcomer. However, everything remained normal, even with his threats and intimidation. Even being technically humiliated, the boy didn't become hostile or react aggressively. And obviously, since it was something discreet, they also didn't push too far. Joyeon, however, was fully aware that there was no way his father had sent that guy without reason. Suddenly, the protagonist receives a good amount of water right in the face. Then Jeoma asks if he is okay, but Nam-in-gu seems much more worried, since he was trying to hit the bald guy with his water cannon and not the leader. Anyway, even though he hadn't done anything so far, that rookie continued to show some kind of intent. A few hours later, already at night, in the middle of a strong wind, Nam-in-gu assured that he would kill someone, especially since they had been sent to clean the hillside for no reason at a time when they should have been sleeping. Moreover, it would only be the four of them, so Juyong wanted them to finish quickly so they could leave. Joyeon thinks that the situation is definitely strange. The prison guard had chosen only the four of them to do this, and the timing only made it seem like something was wrong. As the work of cutting those weeds unfolds, the rookie asks if GM happens to be close to the protagonist, which confuses him. But for him, this confusion is not a problem, as it sounds like a sufficient response to attack without thinking. After all, this had been the conclusion he reached after those long days. Namin arrives at a terrible moment to ask the bald guy to switch roles with him. And coincidentally, this time he is also the first to notice and warn the others with a loud shout. Joyeon doesn't take long to arrive and ask what is happening. However, the blade in the rookie's hand revealed everything, along with the chaotic scene and his words about the hero being late. Anyway, at least now it was no longer necessary to say what the intention of whoever sent him there was. Returning to Round's base sometime in the past, the rookie was praised for becoming a bit smarter. Now he already possessed the teeth of a hunting dog that tears the prey's neck. And if it were up to his father, the boy claimed he would kill anyone without hesitation. That was good to hear, as it was exactly how it should be. Moreover, coincidentally, Ryong informed him that he had arrived at the right time to help with a certain request. The first of these requests was to enter the protagonist's territory and eliminate any external interference. The second was to observe Juyong in his daily routine and identify the people closest to him. And finally, the third, but not least important, was to kill those dear colleagues right in front of the hero. And all of this so that he could become the strongest son, just as Juyong had already predicted. Suddenly, two people start commenting that the rookie's father is completely crazy, which makes him as scared as someone seeing a ghost. Because despite having hit the vital points, both Juyong and Namin were still standing. Of all the things they had, the two had put pigskin on the abdomen for precautionary reasons. Juyeong knew well what Ryeong wanted, to make the sun stronger, and wondered how far he could go. However, he never imagined he would actually use that dirty method again. Anyway, Juyeong is not surprised that he continues to be as repugnant as he has always been. And now that he has evidence incriminating the rookie, he sends him flying with a powerful punch. After all, Juyeong simply can't stand dealing with situations like this anymore. A long time ago, that rookie was abandoned by who should have been his father, and then he was abandoned again by who should have been his mother in a humiliating situation. In the end, even those behind the management of the orphanage abandoned him, and when he threw himself onto the streets and followed the path of crime, who should have been his new family also sold him. When he arrived, all he heard were complaints, as he had been sold as healthy, but he was too thin. Anyway, it was hard to know if he would be useful, and they were whispering that perhaps they should pass him on. However, at that moment when the boy was abandoned for the last time, he decided to make a decision about his own life and ran away. His idea was simply to do everything for whoever took him in as long as he wasn't abandoned again. That was the story of the life of the new cell member from Haiwon's perspective. So as he was walking down the street like a little puppy, she simply picked him up and brought him to the boss. For Gangshin, the boy's blind loyalty must have come from a desire not to be abandoned, and the girl found that quite interesting. After all, it would be a fight to the death between two selected children. After that powerful punch, the protagonist asks his colleagues to go ahead and call the prison guards. They ask why they have to ask for help instead of joining the fight. Then the protagonist explains that all the events that have happened so far were staged scenarios. That's why he is sure they will cover up whatever happens there. But to prevent this from happening, Juyeong asks once again for them to hurry and call the guards to bring them to collect a corpse. According to the actions of the celestial dragon, the tattoo artist asks which of the two will win. In the view of the operations chief, the only similarity is that both were personally trained by the boss. In a fight unfolding between the boys, each lands a solid punch and is thrown back in a way that they seem like clones. This becomes even clearer when they strike and defend themselves with exactly the same kick. Moreover, a hook is thrown at the same instant in the same manner, as well as a well-placed kick to the stomach. Juyeong starts to feel more tired, but the rookie doesn't seem any different at all. Anyway, neither shows any desire to give up, so they continue with that mirrored attack confrontation. From everything Gangshin knows about their fighting style being similar, he believes they will likely be surprised by themselves. Haiwon still asks the boy's opinion on who will win. Back to the battle, the rookie begins to vent about how similar their skills are. He attacks the protagonist right in the middle of the stomach, but Juyeong denies any resemblance. And having held his cellmate's arm before being hit, he grips his hand tightly to execute a twisting technique. Even though they learn from the same person, the protagonist makes it clear that their skill is not the same. His last punch caused the rookie to hit his head so hard against a rock that it broke. However, even after that, he was still conscious and smiling with excitement. This time it's him who grabs the protagonist's arm and while trying to perform the same twisting technique, admits that Juyeong learned them well. As he struggles to replicate it, the rookie tries to use strength to his advantage, so the protagonist warns that it's useless. But suddenly, he's shocked to realize in the worst way that this wasn't the only trick of his rival. Two of his fingers were bitten off in a brutal manner. The protagonist groans in pain but sends the boy flying away with his strongest kick. The rookie, for his part, didn't care about using techniques or brute force because the method didn't interest him. In fact, he admits that he was just following his father's orders and that's why he only needed to kill. However, talking about that man right in front of the protagonist infuriates him. Jaeyoung kicks the enemy again, telling him not to speak about it anymore if he doesn't want to die. This finally makes the boy fall backward to the ground, apparently defeated. From the tattoo artist's perspective, she didn't think it possible for that orphan to defeat the protagonist in a fair fight. And Gangshin had to agree, but only as long as they were unarmed. After all, things could change if either of them managed to get a weapon to use. Back to the battle, a tuft of the protagonist's hair is cut in an instant. Once Ryeong gave the orphan a piece of advice that he keeps to this day. He said that the boy was talented with weapons and that he should use the blades he had now. Precisely because of that, all the cuts on his body are a consequence of his talent. They are results of his father's training in using those blades perfectly. Therefore, he doesn't care how strong Juyeong is nor why he is there. The fact that he is the biological son of the boss has no relevance to what he feels. After all, today will be the day he fulfills the mission of killing him with his own hands, just as his father ordered. Juyeong, however, responds by recalling what he had said before. He had already warned that if the boy didn't want to die painfully, he shouldn't speak of his father in front of him. But still, the kid dared to mention Ryeong 4 times. To Juyeong, it's unimaginable that his enemy hadn't thought that the biological son could also know the blade technique. And conveniently, the protagonist ended up finding a saw nearby that would help not only to cut skin but also bones. So because the rookie mentioned his father's name 4 times that day, Juyeong ensured he would cut him into 4 pieces as punishment. The greatest swordsman in Japan is known by the name of Miyamoto Musashi. He's remembered for having won over 60 battles, and the fencing he used was called the dual sword style, a combat style that soon became the terror of many swordsmen due to its highly destructive killing power. During the fierce battle between the blades of the 2 prisoners, sons of Ryeong, Juyeong manages to perceive the enemy's movement as being this so-called dual sword style. With his speed and the psychological pressure of wielding two swords, he creates unpredictable and irregular cuts, what in fact makes him a more dangerous opponent than the protagonist imagined. The gazes of the two cross in a new powerful attack that creates a shockwave. For the orphan that saw the protagonist is just an industrial tool for cutting wood, which is very different from the fencing passed down by swordsmen over hundreds or even thousands of years. And in his view, a simple saw would not be enough to replicate that. Moreover, that orphan had practiced fencing with maximum vigor since he could remember, and trained precisely with those two swords he now wielded, given to him by his father. Before, he had been taught the vital points of arteries and organs like the heart. If he attacked correctly, the person would be unconscious in a few minutes from blood loss. But the opponents would not be puppets, so they would fight and resist, making it almost impossible to aim accurately in real combat. That said, what they needed to do was reduce the enemy's chances of survival with a combined attack, and without hesitating for a moment to take the opponent's life. Keeping in mind that the fate of a hunting dog that does not do its job is to be abandoned. The next day would be the day of the test, so the supervisor let the boys rest. Among them, the orphan stayed in the corner, and that's why someone went to ask if the noise they heard was his stomach growling. A friendly boy asked if he was the newbie brought by his father, and since he had made an egg to eat, wanted to share. He didn't know much about other subjects, but he made an incredible fried rice. So despite being suspicious, the orphan ate like someone who had been hungry for days. Anyway, the boy knew that the other was there because he had no family and thus introduced himself as Hino, assuring that from that moment on, he would always help him. However, the fate of that friendly boy was not good, and his decision to help that orphan was even worse. In any case, in the test the next day, when the chief was watching, he gave the orphan his approval. The fact that the most skilled child had died in the test happened due to a momentary hesitation. But only someone with unwavering cruelty deserved to be his hunting dog. Because of that, those blades today were thrown at the orphan's feet, because from that moment on, those two blades would be his hunting dog's fangs. The orphan was abandoned by everyone, including a gang of fugitives, but the one who took him in did so willingly, and in the boy's view, gave him a new life. So for him, yes, Raon was considered a true father. As he dodges, the protagonist realizes he is getting cornered. From his gaze, concern begins to grow, and the orphan simply attacks everything in front of him without caring. Be they his cellmates or strangers he has never met, he guarantees he can kill them all. And in his opinion, Juyong is no different. So he advances, claiming he will sink his fangs deep into his neck. In the midst of those attacks, the orphan notices something strange. In his view, anyone can see that the protagonist is the prey. No matter how big the predator is, he is doomed to retreat under this kind of pressure. That's why the boy asks why the protagonist has the eyes of a hunter. Years ago, a knife was placed in the hero's hand with the purpose of stabbing his old man. Rayong said that just once was enough because if he kept swinging his blade without hitting the vital points, it would be useless. The father stated that when his son faced an opponent with a sword in the future, he should not worry about the number of attacks. He should try to avoid fatal injuries and just wait for the opportunity when the opponent showed an opening to thrust his blade. When wielding a sword, he should be prepared to kill his opponent. After all, if he couldn't do that like on that day, that same sword would stab him in the heart. Back to the fight between the two, still fierce, the orphan's blades cross with the protagonist's saw, and a new attack seems to be the one that will finish the hero. However, his hunter's eyes show enough determination to scare the opponent. Clearly, he had been enduring the attacks, clearly wanting to do something about it. However, the orphan advances, saying it is useless to resist, because everything will end with this last blow. But when he gets close enough, Juyong finally finds the vital point he needed, and this time he doesn't miss the chance to end the fight once and for all, making the red color cover the entire ground. Juyong remained on the defensive, waiting for the right moment when his big move would be executed. But, as the orphan had said, the saw is a bit uncomfortable, especially because if he had a sword to use instead of it, it would be the enemy's neck that would have been cut, not half the tree. At this moment in the fight, those words from the old man return to the protagonist's mind. Then he thinks that it's not as if a saw doesn't have its advantages. The pain caused by the saw's jagged teeth tearing through flesh and the agony of feeling the dull metal scraping against bone would generate an indescribable torment, and compared to the cut of a sword, the pain he was about to inflict would be nothing. Despite all the threats, the orphan asks if the protagonist is really as confident as he claims. He questions how someone who has never killed a person in their life could do it now. The orphan practically mocks, asking to be killed, since if not, he will take revenge by going after Juyong's loved ones. And finally, he promises to drive his blade right into the hero's chest. Because of this threat, Juyong takes the situation seriously and comments that he has a special talent for irritating people, thus concluding the confrontation with one last move. However, the blade ends up not hitting the opponent's face as planned, as it breaks in half during the attack. In the end, the protagonist comments that he doesn't need to do this himself, since in his opinion, he can simply leave the boy there to bleed until he passes out. However, the orphan knew well what was happening. When Juyong pulled the saw, he broke the blade on purpose. But the boy's hunting dog mind couldn't understand the reason. Returning to the prison corridor where the infirmary is located, one of the main group prisoners shouts that he is going to die. Continuing, he alerts the doctor, saying that the newbie in the cell stabbed him. However, Jayama makes a point of saying that he was not directly hit, despite the boy's commotion. Finally, they start to argue about the confusion the new prisoner caused. But when the protagonist stands up, Jayama really wants to know what he did in that fight to leave the other in such a grave state. This, however, is enough for Ju-young to understand not only that he survived, but also Ryong's true objective. First, his father intended to hurt the people around him and provoke his anger. Secondly, by putting lives in grave danger to create as much chaos and confusion as possible. Finally, his strategy was to manipulate him into finally killing someone with his own hands. As a result, he would have crossed the moral barrier he had maintained until then as a human being. At that moment, if the orphan had at least not acted as if he were desperate to die, Ju-young could have done it. However, he realized and now knew that even inside the prison, Ryong was trying to mold him to his liking. The hero's new atmosphere frightens his peers, but he cannot contain the disgust he feels. Namin asks if the protagonist wants to be transferred to a private room, but Ju-young does not respond, still lost in thought. He didn't want to be misunderstood by his father, as taking control of the juvenile prison was his true goal. However, Ju-young was determined to deal with everything else in his own way. In an ambulance, speeding away from the prison, that orphan receives serum while being attended to by a nurse. At a certain moment, he wakes up but cannot thank for still being alive. His situation reminds him of a moment from childhood when two men were trying to restrain a dog. In their view, even if it was an animal, he should have realized he was being abandoned, despite having hunted pheasants and rabbits. At his peak, when a hunting dog fails to do its job, this is what happens. At another moment, when a collie had a failure, the father said he was disappointed, and repeated the phrase, saying that a hunting dog that doesn't work well is useless. Therefore, even though he was a child, he ordered that boy to be thrown away. Having remembered all this, despair begins to take over. The boy quickly removes the accesses he has in his veins and runs, afraid of being abandoned. If he returned like this, he would be discarded by his father, and he hated that, so he needed to complete his mission. The problem was that, for some reason, the door wouldn't open. But that reason appeared behind him, asking if he was trying to escape from the gang. Gangshin explains firsthand that a dog that tries to break its collar is immediately discarded. Then he asks if the boy has any last words, but even having been betrayed, he simply thanks, and asks to be killed before he is abandoned again. A few moments later, Gangshin answers a phone call to report that the situation was resolved. Upon checking, right after boarding the ambulance, the boy was still gravely injured. But as expected from the young master, the armed challenge was not enough to kill him. Hearing this on the other end of the line, in a meeting with others just as important, Ryong claims to have understood, and he hangs up, saying he will get in touch later. One of the people in the meeting expresses hope that nothing has happened to his son. Then Ryong responds with uncontrolled laughter, which makes the bald man think that, in fact, something good has happened. However, this also irritates him because he didn't want to appear in good spirits. He states that raising children doesn't always happen according to the parents' wishes. In the end, the son did not kill the prey he sent, even when he delivered the opportunity on a silver platter. Therefore, he believes he will need a more guaranteed way to educate his son. Suddenly, another call comes in, but this time from the juvenile detention center, and Ryong answers immediately. On the other end of the line, the director screams that something horrible is happening. Jo-young-cha, or rather Ryong's son, had just suffered a terrible accident. To explain better, at the location of the laundry for unknown reasons, the protagonist began to cause a commotion. Regarding the commotion, Ryong asked the director to explain further. Soon after recovering, Ju-young went to a rather hostile place where he provoked several enemies. This time, his actions would truly put him in danger, and particularly, in the director's view, the greatest chance was that he wouldn't make it out alive. Many days ago in winter, Ryong once went to the east of Siberia, a place where the federal government could not intervene to strike a weapons deal with the Russian mafia. But in the meeting area, there were dismembered mafia corpses everywhere, and in that same place, the boss came face to face with a kind of giant bear. It was at that moment he realized, in the face of absolute fear, that even he, Ryong-cha, could not react depending on the danger. As this story was being told to the protagonist, he asked about the bear's skin, and the father replied that he had hunted it long ago with his own hands. Still, according to the boss's words, the animal had torn the entire mafia to pieces. However, Ryong made a point of saying that it was possible to win as long as one knew how to deal with that. Soon the protagonist would be in high school, and it was time to plant this idea in his mind. The only way to transcend the limits of the abilities granted to the human species would only be achieved through a transcendent heart. The protagonist's father was someone who wanted him to grow strong in his own way, but in a safe place. He did not wish for his only blood son to die or become disabled. But our hero preferred to die than to enter his plans as a puppet. Those prisoners who came to confront him did not understand the reason for all this madness, but wanted to know where the store money was. Anyway, the protagonist was about to do what Ryong hated most, putting his own son in danger. Naturally, given the place he was in, the prisoners began to understand what was happening. In fact, all the money was inside the washing machine. They began to panic, as if that was the bribe they were supposed to give the director to keep themselves afloat. The protagonist knew this very well. In this case, the prisoners gave up on resolving the situation through conversation, but the protagonist attacked first, ordering everyone to come to him. The other prisoners wasted no time and attacked together, but they were all eliminated like the weaklings they were. What he was actually looking for were the cell leaders. Hearing this, an enemy attacked, shouting that he would not take orders from someone like Ju-young. However, he also suffered the same fate as the others, being slammed into the ground with a punch. In the end, everyone there ended up collapsing unconscious in the laundry. Finally, someone with the title of cell leader appeared, and seeing all those people in the situation the protagonist left them in, commented to his subordinates that it seemed they would have to go in. Still, regardless of the number of weaklings that came to confront him, Ju-young continued knowing he would not be in danger. Thus, seeing that he had no injuries, he knew the plan would not work. That messy-haired boy, however, was the one who brought the store money when the hero ordered the theft. At this rate, the other cell leaders would surely not let this pass easily. But he did not know what the protagonist was trying to do or how he planned to get out of that situation. Even he could not imagine a way, but he was dying of curiosity to know. Later, in another corner of the detention center, the protagonist sits alone waiting for something, until that something finally finds him and begins to walk slowly in his direction. This is Guan Yun-woo, and his appearance is that of a rather hostile bald man, as he heard that Ju-young stole his money and put it in the washing machine. In response, the protagonist said he was just trying to take the money. Then the bald man replied that he still hadn't understood how serious the situation was, and he asked if he thought he was the only cell leader coming to collect for this misunderstanding. In fact, from what was being shown, many were unhappy with the losses they had suffered. Ju-ching, leader of Cell 4, also didn't like the protagonist at the meeting. Se-jin Hong, leader of Cell 17, on his part, comments that there is nothing he loves more than strong men. The twin leaders of Cells 12 and 13, Ji-won and Ju-won Min, truly do not like the hero. Meanwhile, Hinan Su-yu is desperate for having lost all his money. At this rate, Shul Ryu, leader of Cell 7 in Block 2, comments that all the stores will close. Jun-hyuk Lee from Cell 19 in Block 4 believes they should charge the protagonist's family. His colleagues, on their part, unfortunately watch the situation from inside the cell, desperate. After all, the protagonist was facing simply all the cell leaders. Nam In-gyud finds it strange because there was no meeting scheduled for today. The atmosphere is also strange and makes him feel like he could die at any moment. Anyway, another person calls the protagonist, giving him for the first and last time a chance to apologize for his actions. This is Minchul Jum from Cell 1 in Block 1. Jo-yeon even hears this proposal, but it seems none of them show a willingness to listen to something like that. In the view of the criminals, anyone who disturbs the order must be immediately eliminated. This is the trait that unites them. What the protagonist's father was about to instill in him that day was the way to transcend human limits, the form called Transcendent Heart, transcending the mind using emotions as a means to go beyond one's own limits. Simply put, it was a state that quickly elevated most human abilities, and Rayon asked him to observe closely, demonstrating such ability with a simple slap on the ground that extinguished all the candles. That was his final lesson for the protagonist as a biological father. Back in the present, as the criminal's fist approach, Ju-yeon begins to calm his own heart. Then, in the last moment, in a fraction of a second, he strikes both of them squarely, making them fall to the ground like ragdolls. Even his colleagues can't believe it, and inevitably, the other leaders begin to feel fear. After all, the protagonist had just defeated 2 cell leaders with just 1 attack. In the end, the messy-haired boy loved the situation. Jo-young was causing a great commotion, and he wondered how he would get out of this. But now he realized that instead of planning an escape, the protagonist wanted to defeat everyone. Jo-young, for his part, never wanted that thing his father instilled in him, even if it meant he had to die. However, given the situation he was in now, he didn't think he had much choice. In 2003, in North America, an ordinary housewife flipped her car to save her daughter who was trapped under a tire. In 1979, in North Korea, motivated by the desire to escape the dictatorship, a person swam in seawater with a temperature of -14 degrees for 12 hours. In 1732, in Africa, a man driven by a burning desire for revenge against a rival tribe fought for 47 seconds wielding a spear even after his heart stopped beating. Similar to these scenarios, sometimes in this world, superhuman phenomena occur where humans surpass their own capabilities. This is not about miracles or incredible coincidences of fate, but rather about emotions. Emotion amplified to such an extreme in response to the situation faced, to the point of impacting the body itself. This is called Transcendent Heart, which is the only way for a human being to transcend the limitations imposed by their own species. And at that very moment, the emotion that completely filled the protagonist's heart as he entered the Transcendent Heart stage was definitely nothing other than an intense anger directed at the figure of his father, Gang Ryeon. In the director's office, he despairs, asking if what he is seeing is real. Jo-young, along with the leaders of the other cells, was doing something unthinkable in the prison yard. Back to the fight, Jo-young comments that he would rather die than use this, but it seemed that, nonetheless, he didn't have much choice, especially since he needed to fill his head with thoughts related to him to activate the ability, and something like that was definitely the worst-case scenario. One of the enemies mocks as he sees the protagonist continue murmuring as if he were doing a monologue. Then he advances, calling the boy a loner and saying he will put an end to the annoying brat once and for all. Until because, according to him, he was the one who truly knew what it meant to always be alone. Unlike the other leaders, Hyeonsu had always been alone, so even the sound of the others' cheerful conversation was irritating. In his view, all he did was discipline those noisy brats, yet the world began to treat him as if he were a demon. Regardless of that, the maniac receives a blow right in the middle of his stomach, being thrown far away and scaring even more his fellow cell leaders. And Ju-young ends up saying that no one cares about his sad story. At that moment, right behind him, Jun-hyuk appears, aiming for the hero's Achilles tendon. And just thinking about the sound you would hear when cutting, he feels joy. The sound of tendons tearing and ligaments contracting. When those sounds vibrate in his eardrums, they send chills throughout his body. Hyeonsu was particularly sensitive to sound since childhood, and that's why people called him a genius. until the day everything changed. But his story is also interrupted by a brutal blow from the protagonist, who sends the secondary character back to irrelevance. In the protagonist's cell, his colleagues can't understand how he defeated 4 big fish so quickly. Jo-young, for his part, shows no fear and tells all the remaining enemies to keep coming. Then, one of the bravest accepts the challenge and attacks the boy, throwing him against the wall. This time, Chul takes on the role of ending the fight. In Chul's life, defeat is a word that does not exist in his dictionary. Or rather, he couldn't afford to have it present in his dictionary. To protect his people, he needed to win, no matter what happened. However, in a somewhat funny way, he also had his face smashed with a single blow from the protagonist, which made him fly like Superman and land like a rotten tomato. Jo-young tries to warn that while using that, it's as if he were invincible. But this time, the twins take the initiative to attack, believing it will be different. Ji-won and Ju-won initiate the charge, and along with it, a brief origin story. They were newborn babies, but they never even got to see their mother's eyes. As time passed, that cold gaze began to turn into brutal abuse. However, this time it was the protagonist who was abusing, with ignorant punches that even cut through the flashbacks. After all, they had made the mistake of mentioning the word family in front of him. From atop one of the prison buildings, the messy-haired boy wanted to know what made the hero so confident to cause all this chaos. However, it was now clear that he had a plan hidden up his sleeves. Finally, it was Sejun's turn, the one who loves strong men, to try his luck. In fact, for him, gender didn't matter. He simply had a thing for strong people. After all, the world is vast and people have all kinds of tastes, but for him, now the world was reduced to the protagonist's hand crushing his face against the ground. After all this display of strength, the last one appears, impressed that the protagonist had defeated the others so easily. So he claims he wants to fight with the due respect of a member of the Celestial Dragon. Finally, the protagonist was going to face one of the members of that Dan clan who was already prepared. Everyone's attention was focused on the fight that was about to unfold at that moment between those two powers. And so the night passed and morning arrived, with the sunrise revealing the state of the last leader, which meant that 9 had already been eliminated. Anyway, even having won, it took longer than the boy expected. The director, in turn, looked pale as if he were watching an action scene from a movie. Ryong had still not been informed of what was happening and wanted to know if his son was safe. However, in an instant, the protagonist was already well ahead of the director with an expression of someone who could kill whenever he wanted. Because of this, it wasn't difficult to take the phone and join the call with whoever was on the other end of the line. And as he already knew who the director was talking to, Ju-young simply greeted his father since it had been a long time. Returning to the prison in the morning, a certain boy starts clapping several times. The claps come from the messy-haired boy who was loving the show. That had been a fight worth recording in history, and he felt sorry for not having filmed it. But just thinking that he got to see something so grand in person made him very happy. Anyway, the boy asks what he should do, since he probably would never feel such a level of euphoria again in the future. At least that's what he thinks, limiting his destiny to that prison. In that conversation between father and son, once again the protagonist greets the old man. Alone in a house after the meeting, Ryong responds by asking if the detention staff are feeding him well. Jo-young explains that the prison food surprisingly matches his taste, but that's not all. He also mentions that there is running warm water and scheduled sessions where he can exercise. In fact, the protagonist claims that it is much better there than it was at his home when he wasn't imprisoned, except for the monotonous routine. Thanks to a certain gift that his father recently sent, things have also become a bit less boring. In light of this, Ryong states that it is a relief that everything is going well with his son. But getting straight to the point that matters most, he asks what led him to do something so reckless. Then the hero responds that he wishes to leave that place and the grips that control the prison. The father tries to confirm, and the answer comes back the same right away. After all, he realized something that changed everything. He realized that that place, which he thought was just fiction, really exists. Finally, the protagonist also cuts off his father when he tries to say something, merely advising him to clean his neck for when the time comes to be cut, which, despite still being a distant reality, leaves the father quite reflective. In the prison director's office, a widespread punishment was taking place. After all, it seemed they wanted to lose their jobs, since none managed to stop a single cell leader. This time, the director knows that the protagonist is in real trouble, even with so many guards, so they apologize. In the end, the scale of the incident was so great that the director begins to think it will be too difficult to deal with him now. At that moment, one of the guards starts to understand what the chief is trying to say. What he intends now is to send Jo-young to the other place. The director wishes to avoid this at all costs, as Ryong will certainly freak out if he finds out. After all, there is no father in the world who wants to see his son being sent to a place like that. Back in the protagonist's cell, he admits that they may have tried too hard, but if they are hungry, at least he managed to get plenty of good food for everyone. They hadn't even asked for it, but ended up having a lavish feast with about twice as much food as usual. Because of this, the situation led everyone to put the protagonist on a pedestal. One claims he will support him as an older brother from now on, and another says he will bow once a day. However, Nam and Gyu insists on declaring himself, strangely, as the dog he loves the most. Even so, the others say that the protagonist is not an ordinary leader. For everything he has done, he is the leader of cell number 1, the one who took care of 9 leaders at once. and that means that the prison they are in is the most powerful, and that they are now the owners of everything. Jae-mao also enjoys the food, but amidst this, he notices something more important. He realizes that the protagonist is behaving strangely. Knowing this, he asks what the hero is doing, which Namin also does. However, he does not respond and lets his friends eat first, since it will be hard to have food like this from now on. Namin does not understand what he means by, "They should eat while they can." But the protagonist clarifies, placing a type of book on his friend's chest, just in case he needs it. Seeing how good Namin is at lying, the hero believes he is a smart guy. Therefore, if he has nothing else to do, he told him to study. What made him so confident that it made Namin think he might be able to get into Seoul University. On the other hand, Jae-yum also did not miss out and received a gift. Namin feels jealous right away, thinking that his book must be better. However, since the protagonist noticed that he was always scribbling in the agenda alone, he gave this so he could write a letter to his family, so that his parents wouldn't have to worry about him anymore. And since the protagonist had no one to send letters to, he thought it was good to do this. In the end, the two realized that there is something strange about the hero. First, he asked for a ton of chicken, and now he is giving things away and saying words he has never said, as if he were about to go very far and never come back. It doesn't take long for the protagonist to admit, since he knew well that Namin, in particular, was quick to notice how things were unfolding. At that moment, a guard appears calling prisoner number 1799 to gather all his belongings and leave. He also asks if they have finished their goodbyes, which leaves everyone a bit confused. Initially, they think he's being transferred to another solitary confinement. However, the hero explains that because of what he did, his friends will no longer see him in that prison, at least for now. He says he has something he needs to do and that leaving is part of the plan to achieve what he wants. Namin, in turn, shouts for him to wait because they haven't had a proper goodbye yet. However, the protagonist simply thanks him, saying he wasn't bored during his time there. And smiling, he states that it was also fun, but assures them they won't meet again, at least not in that prison. In the end, Namin is the one who responds with gratitude for everything the hero did. And as you mentioned before, Jae-yum reminds him that his sentence is 20 years. Therefore, he asks him to visit when he can so he won't get bored. But Jae-yum leaves the idea hanging that maybe it won't be that long. Back at the Celestial Dragon base, some decorative items are destroyed. In fact, much more than simple decorations. After all, a father was angry with his son. Raon was furious, enraged that his son had no idea how much he cares. In his view, it was still not the time for Ju-young to destroy that place. Because what awaits an insect that escapes from a jar is simply another, even bigger jar with a more poisonous insect. So all he can do is hope his son stays focused. On the night of the same day, the guard accompanying the protagonist asks if he knows where they are going. Although it is confidential, he believes he can share it now. He then reveals that there is another prison beyond the first section, juvenile prison, one that has never been disclosed to the public. Within that same structure is the second section, juvenile detention. This is the first time the protagonist has gotten so close to that place. Before, he knew he needed to think of the quickest way to escape his father's clutches until he finally reached his neck. In this case, the one with messy hair had given an idea, a rumor that circulated like an urban legend. They said that was not the only juvenile prison existing there. They said that behind the trees, behind the cells, there was another detention center for those who messed everything up, which seemed completely absurd. Anyway, the boy only shared it for fun and asked him not to think too much about it. But since the topic was mentioned, the protagonist decided to ask for one last favor. About all the money that the cell leaders used to bribe the director, he thought it would be a good idea to steal it all. Back to the present, after a not-so-long walk, the two arrive at the place where the protagonist will stay from now on. This is the facility that holds prisoners who are out of any kind of control. The place where our hero is now is the prison that can be called the second section of the Juvenile Detention Center. In a luxurious sauna, the tattoo artist was enjoying a vintage 2002 Shechul Lafite. Along with that, a bath in the hot springs of Hakone Yumoto made that day perfect, so the girl vents that it is truly fantastic. She wonders if it's okay to have fun alone, especially considering that her young master is currently in a place like that. Anyway, she just hopes he is safe in the second section juvenile prison. After all, he will need luck to deal with the sharks that exist there. Back to the protagonist's perspective, he is finally introduced to the juvenile prison where he will stay. The guard comments that he has heard about the problems caused by the protagonist in the previous prison. Therefore, he wonders if he will be able to do the same in this place. The second section of the Juvenile Detention Center is a place where uncontrollable prisoners are kept incarcerated, but Ju-yeon thinks he is prepared. As soon as they enter, someone comes to welcome the newcomer, to the surprise of our hero. And, with a smile on his face, he asks if they have a new member there. The same person gets irritated by the protagonist being handsome. Ju-yeon heard that this was the place where uncontrollable prisoners were being held, so since prisoner number 4889 wasn't stopping, a fight could happen. However, he simply informed that he was going to the infirmary, and that he had already communicated this earlier. Therefore, the guard remembered and continued showing the place to our hero, who began to find things strange. After all, everyone he saw around him didn't seem like uncontrollable prisoners. In fact, the young people beside him all seemed to be ordinary prisoners. Just for that reason, the place was so mysterious, and the feeling of discomfort grew even stronger. The guard asks if the hero is surprised that the environment seems more normal than expected. However, he warns that soon he will discover the secret that makes that place so different. It is said that just ahead is the director's office, and before entering the room, a painting of a bleeding megalodon biting its prey catches the eye. Both the fish and the corals, the sand, the ambient temperature, and the proper humidity are important. In addition, light for 8 to 12 hours with the correct pH and balanced oxygen. If one creates such an environment and common glass tank, it is said that they will have an ecosystem in their hands, and that there is nothing more beautiful and harmonious. When looking inside this aquarium, the director feels as if he were God. This is Wancheng Ma, director of the second section. He created the system of Section 2 inspired by an aquarium, using order and beauty as a foundation. A common prison has an annual accident rate of over 20%, but here, where they are now, the average is less than a tenth of that. Wancheng considers this achievement something incredible for a place with uncontrollable prisoners. That is why he asks the new inmate what he thinks of this system. Without even hiding it, the protagonist states that he does not understand. But the director makes an effort to make things easier to comprehend. He explains that inside an aquarium there are all kinds of fish, but they do not attack each other as they do in the ocean. And the reason for this is that in the aquarium, disconnected from the outside world, there is a predator at the top of the food chain. This predator is the overwhelming shark, which imposes itself over the others. Unlike the sea, whose space is infinite, in this aquarium the fish have nowhere to run, and a shark at the top keeps them on constant alert just with its presence, preventing them from fighting. Ironically, it is the presence of a predator at the top of the chain that allows for the maintenance of peace. That said, Wancheng asks once again for the protagonist's opinion, since he can now be considered the newest shark present in that inmate aquarium. Regarding the director of Section 2, Haewon comments that he was a famous social and criminal psychologist who participated in conferences abroad. But one day, when he came to Korea and was appointed director of a juvenile prison, he surprised everyone. He became a nuisance, even for the Heavenly Dragon. Unlike the director of Section 1, who was easily bought, Wancheng did not respond to any kind of bribery. After all, his real interests were only in the prison system he created, and he called it something like the shark paradox. Thinking that there is such a dark side to a state institution makes one question what the government was thinking. And if focusing on the bad side, what fits that description the most is the director of the place himself. After all, he is truly no joke. That is why, for the first time, Haewon considers that the young master is indeed in danger. Back to the conversation in the director's office, the protagonist asks if that is really the shark. Then Wancheng replies that yes, revealing that all the prisoners he has seen so far were just fish. As for the rest of the composition, he decides not to repeat it, since it was already clear that there was the necessary environment to be an aquarium. As the predator at the top of the food chain, he is the shark and can simply swim as much as he wants. Despite this, the hero responds to the statement saying he really has no idea what the director is talking about. Moreover, he states that he does not care, and if the conversation is over, turns to leave. That is why Wancheng begins to murmur that there is nothing more exciting than explaining his theory to someone who does not understand. And with the protagonist being one of them, he flies at the boy's neck in an instant, pinning him against the wall and creating a huge crack in it. After all, this is the way that makes the most sense to help Ju-young understand his situation. The director of the juvenile prison of Section 2, Wancheng Ma, is a dual citizen of the United States and South Korea and studied social psychology at an Ivy League university. He received recognition for his research work in academic circles, where the United Nations Research Institute for National Development and the MIT Study Center offered him positions. Even so, he chose to return to Korea. In a conversation, someone tells the doctor it is an honor that he chose the country. The reason they wanted to see him that day was due to concerns about his appointment as director of the juvenile prison. A bureaucrat warned that there were young offenders whose violent crimes made them completely uncontrollable. Wancheng in turn proposed a social correction experiment aimed at these difficult-to-manage individuals. After considerable effort, he managed to gain approval within the legal framework of the country. Still, if the prisoner control experiment failed in that section, everything would be lost. In the end, the reason the government approved Wancheng's absurd plan was not only due to his research achievements, but also because of his overwhelming military capability, which allowed him to suppress violent criminals in emergency situations. After all, he was a former member of the United States Special Forces. Moreover, he is also a sociologist, and in his view, one's duty is to explore the phenomena occurring in society. Because of this, holding the protagonist by the neck, he asks what kind of shark he is and lands a monstrous punch that simply destroys everything in its path. Fortunately, when the dust settles, the protagonist had already dodged away, but this only makes the director even more curious. In the blink of an eye, he disappears and reappears behind the boy, determined to clarify these doubts. This time, Wancheng manages to hit the hero squarely right in the middle of the abdomen, causing him to crash backward against a table full of personal belongings. It is said that currently 4 sharks are incarcerated in this prison, and that the director, obviously, differentiated them in his own way. Now, as quickly as possible, while Wancheng attacks relentlessly, he asks the protagonist to show what kind of shark he is. In fact, he practically begs, and finally, what he was looking for happens. For Ju-young holds back his attack, making the director feel fear, and soon disappears again, further amplifying that sensation. In contrast, our hero displays an extremely confident expression completely opposite to what the director had imagined until then. However, at a certain moment, Wancheng starts laughing, saying it's unbelievable spectacular, among other adjectives including even swear words. Finally, Wancheng calls the guard and asks him to bring a certain thing immediately. He explains that in that prison there is a rank called Special Management. Personally, he prefers to call them sharks, but unfortunately, the superiors did not approve the term due to a lack of sense of humor. In any case, a box with the protagonist's new uniform and a black badge is delivered to him. In most Korean prisons, badges determine the level of dangerousness and the sentence of the inmate, ranging from white to red. But in that prison there are only two: white badges for general management and black for special management, which in the director's opinion, the protagonist would quickly understand the meaning. Anyway, Wancheng waits until the noises finish, ensuring he is alone, then begins to mentally review that even having attacked 21 times, Juyong incredibly had more opportunities. In the end, he was still surprised, as the boy's attitude was as if he didn't even deserve attention. The moment Juyong disappeared was the one that stuck most in his mind. That's why, literally, this was the first time he encountered a case he couldn't classify. Now he wishes to use any possible method to discover both the strength and the true identity of Juyong. However, for now, he can only analyze and wait for him to reveal it on his own. Sometime later, in the juvenile detention center, in the first floor common room hallway, a person screams for a clear reason. After all, the shark was coming to their cell. They comment to their colleague, who is obviously scared, but the other one tells him not to worry as he has a plan. First, they would block his line of sight and then use a rope to suffocate him and dispose of the evidence in the toilet. That was the best plan they found to face the great evil called shark. Finally, the said predator, Juyong, arrives at the place asking if he is in the right room. Then the two, still hidden in the shadows, take a deep breath and remember the first step of the plan. Taesun Woo, however, does exactly the opposite of what he said, presenting himself like a loyal puppy. In this case, Yono Jung has no choice but to go along with it. Finally, Juyong observes the situation calmly and understands that those are the fish the director had talked about. But as this is his new area of coexistence, he comments from what he can observe that it's not bad at all. Changing the subject, he quickly asks where his bed is, so the two rush to try to be helpful in some way. Taesun starts promoting the mattress, trying to see if the protagonist is interested in lying down. Joyam, for his part, comments that he will only do so after the roll call, which should be soon at night. However, neither of the boys understands what he is saying. They explain that the prison authorities don't do that there, and that they are free to do whatever they want. This concept of freedom within a prison makes Juyong think, because even with so few restrictions, the incident rate in that place was close to zero. After a rather hectic day, night falls on the prison along with an uncomfortable silence in the corridors. Taesun, however, sleeps peacefully, dreaming of healthy things like using hydrochloric acid to dispose of bodies. Yuminho, in turn, suffers from insomnia consumed by the fear he feels. And at a certain moment, the new shark of the juvenile detention center of the second section also wakes up. In this place, the guards did not interfere in the prisoner's affairs, yet the incident rate remained at the lowest possible level. Regarding this, Juyong gets up knowing that the reason is the other 4 sharks incarcerated within this prison. Thus, he thinks more about the concept of sharks there. And, as the environment is completely calm, decides it's time to see with his own eyes who they are. It enters the hero's imagination that beyond that door, he might find the other sharks. However, when he tries, he is in for a surprise. For some reason he still doesn't understand, the door to his cell is locked. It seems that, although the director does not directly interfere in the prison's affairs, that does not mean he does not keep them under control. Therefore, Juyong concludes that there is still much about that place he does not comprehend. But instead of giving up, he becomes determined to discover more. The next morning, while the shark still sleeps, the fish conspire to take him down with a bathroom pipe. Those boys practically fight to see who will be the first to act. However, for the misfortune of both, just at that moment, Juyong opens his eyes, catching them in the act. Fearing for their lives, both Yunho and Taesun throw themselves to the ground, returning to the positions of loyal dogs. Finally, Juyong comments that he is hungry and therefore asks what time the doors open for meals, which once again leaves the boys confused. After all, the cell doors were already open, to the protagonist's surprise, which he only realizes when they show him. Definitely it was closed, but regarding this, Taesun explains that there is a specific schedule in which the doors open and close automatically. Thus, during the time it is open, he is free to do as he pleases, which in the protagonist's opinion is quite peculiar. In reality, every aspect of this section 2 is viewed completely differently from section 1. Meanwhile, in a distant place in a luxurious car, someone comments on a certain injury, but the person in question says it was nothing serious. He claims to have had just a small incident some time ago, and another person in the car does not judge him, thinking he is still too young to fight. Still, for a nameless low-ranking subordinate, calling him there makes the man ask if the boy understands what that means. Jongshin Park, however, never thought his lord would come personally, but the truth is that the boy Juyeon Cha, who had been mentioned, piqued the chief's interest. Therefore, he was willing to see everything with his own eyes. Just by hearing the protagonist's name, Jongshin remembers the amount of trouble he caused. However, just when he thought he was merely a lunatic, he ended up discovering something strange. The truth was that most of the guys he fought were members of the Celestial Dragon. About this information he just revealed, Jongshin explained that he had overheard it during a phone conversation with the director. Additionally, he also heard something like, "I'm going now to where your son is," which led him to discover that Juyeong Cha's father was Gang Ryeon, simply the second in command of the Celestial Dragon clan.